Eleanor Brennan stood trembling in the dusty Texas chapel, her plain grey dress and work-worn hands a stark contrast to rancher Cole Hartford's finest Sunday suit, when she finally voiced the fear that had haunted her since his unexpected proposal. "I'm too plain to be your bride, sir," she whispered, loud enough for the gathered townspeople to hear. What Cole said next, 3 simple words that cut through every whisper and sideways glance, would echo through Redemption Creek for generations, transforming not just Eleanor's fate, but the very definition of beauty itself. "You're enough, Eleanor." Cole's voice carried through the chapel with such quiet certainty that the whispers died like candle flames snuffed by wind. The words struck Eleanor with physical force, her knees weakening beneath the simple grey dress she'd sewn herself because she owned nothing fine enough for a wedding, even a wedding she'd never imagined would be hers. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat, his Bible trembling slightly in his aged hands as he watched the scene unfold with an expression caught between pastoral concern and human curiosity. The late afternoon sun streamed through the chapel's single stained glass window, a modest piece depicting a shepherd and his flock, casting coloured shadows across the rough wooden pews, where Redemption Creek's finest citizens sat in various states of shock, judgment, and barely concealed delight at the spectacle. Eleanor could feel their eyes on her like brands, cataloguing every flaw she'd spent 26 years trying to make invisible through sheer competence and useful labour. Her hair, the colour of dull copper, refused to hold a curl and hung in a simple braid down her back. Her face, dusted with freckles that darkened with every hour she spent in the Texas sun, had never launched a single admiring glance, let alone 1,000 ships. Her frame, thin and angular from years of hard work and immodest meals, bore none of the curves that men's eyes followed when Beatrice Sutton walked past. Beatrice sat in the third pew now, her perfect rosebud mouth curved in a smart smile that didn't reach her cornflower blue eyes, her golden hair arranged in elaborate curls that must have taken her maid 2 hours to perfect, her green silk dress cut to showcase a figure that made strong men stumble over their own boots. She'd been so certain that Cole Hartford would propose to her. Everyone had been certain, and the shock when he'd appeared at Eleanor's tiny room behind the boarding house 3 weeks ago still reverberated through the town like the aftershocks of an earthquake. Eleanor had been mending Mrs. Patterson's torn petticoat when the knock came, her fingers working the needle with the unconscious skill of 14 years' practice, ever since the fever took her parents and left her orphaned at 12 with nothing but a talent for making broken things whole again. The boarding house keeper, Mrs. Chen, had taken her in out of Christian charity and pragmatic need, trading room and board for Eleanor's help with laundry, mending, and the endless domestic tasks that kept a boarding house running. Eleanor had watched from her window as other girls her age had married, had seen them transformed from giggling children to nervous brides to weary mothers, their lives following a pattern she'd believed would never include her. Stay with me, friends, and comment your city below. I'm sharing this story from Denver, Colorado. Subscribe to my channel, and let's see how far our story travels today. Plain Eleanor, useful Eleanor, invisible Eleanor who could let out a hem or take in a waist or remove any stain known to Texas womankind, but who would never herself wear a wedding dress or feel a man's desire or bear children who might inherit her unfortunate features. She'd made peace with it, or thought she had, finding satisfaction in work well done and purpose in being needed, if not wanted. Then Cole Hartford had filled her doorway, hat in hands, his weathered face serious as he explained in his careful way that his mother had died 6 months past and left behind a wedding quilt that had torn during the burial preparations, a family heirloom that needed mending before he could lay it across his own marriage bed whenever that day might come. Eleanor had examined the quilt with professional assessment, noting the intricate stitching, the careful pattern of interlocking rings that symbolized eternal love, the places where time and grief had weakened the fabric. She could fix it, she'd told him. It would take perhaps 3 weeks of evening work after her other obligations, and she'd do it for $2 because she understood the quilt's value was beyond money. Cole had agreed without haggling, unusual for a rancher, and had ridden away leaving Eleanor with the most beautiful piece of handwork she'd ever touched and a strange feeling she couldn't name. She'd worked on that quilt every evening, her lamp burning late as her fingers traced the patterns Cole's mother had created, feeling an odd intimacy with a woman she'd never met, but whose love language spoke through every carefully placed stitch. The rings interlocked with mathematical precision, but also with something else, something that suggested the maker understood that love was both practical and mysterious, both planned and surprising. Eleanor had found herself imagining the Woman who'd made this quilt, wondering if she'd been beautiful or plain, if she'd married for love or necessity, if she'd been happy in the life she'd built with her hands and heart. When Cole returned 3 weeks later to collect the finished work, he'd stood in her small room examining her repairs with an intensity that made her nervous, his calloused fingers tracing the places where her stitches joined his mother's, so perfectly matched that only someone looking very carefully could tell where old work ended and new began. "You have a gift," he'd said finally, and Eleanor had started to demur, to minimize her skill as she'd learned to minimize everything about herself, when he'd interrupted her. "Miss Brennan, I need a wife." The words had struck her silent, her mind racing through impossible explanations until he had continued, in that same careful tone. "I need to marry before my 35th birthday next month or lose my ranch to my cousin Vincent, according to my mother's will. And I find I cannot bring myself to marry any of the women who've made their interest known, because I don't trust their reasons or their character. But you, Miss Brennan, you see what's broken and make it whole. You take what's been damaged and restore it with such care that the repair becomes part of the beauty rather than a flaw to hide. And I think that's the kind of woman who might take a damaged man in a complicated situation and make something good from it." Eleanor had stared at him, certain she'd misheard, waiting for the jest or the cruel revelation that this was some elaborate prank. But his grey eyes had held nothing but sincerity and something that might have been hope, if she'd dared believe it. She tried to explain all the reasons he was making a mistake. Her plainness, her poverty, her complete unsuitability to be the wife of the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. But he'd listened to each objection and dismissed it with the same patient certainty. "I'm not looking for beauty that fades or wealth I already have or social graces that mean nothing when the work needs doing," he'd said. "I'm looking for someone I can trust, someone who understands that broken things deserve care, someone who won't leave when times get hard because you've already survived hard times and kept your integrity intact, and if you'll have me, Miss Brennan, I'll count myself fortunate beyond deserving." She'd said yes because refusing seemed more terrifying than accepting, because some small, foolish part of her heart wanted to believe that perhaps competence could be valued as much as beauty, because she was tired of being invisible, and this man was offering to see her even if he saw only her usefulness. Now, standing before God and Redemption Creek with her inadequacy laid bare for all to witness, Eleanor felt the full weight of her mistake. "You're enough, Eleanor." The words hung in the air like a promise or a lie. She couldn't tell which, couldn't process anything beyond the hammering of her heart and the burning of her cheeks and the terrible awareness that everyone was watching her humiliation. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front pew dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief embroidered with flowers Eleanor herself had stitched during a long winter evening. Tom Patterson, beside his wife, looked uncomfortable in his Sunday suit, his expression suggesting he thought the whole situation irregular, but was too polite to say so. The Morrison family occupied the second pew, Judge Morrison's face carefully neutral as befitted a man of law, his wife whispering behind her gloved hand to their eldest daughter, who'd been one of the girls Eleanor had watched marry 5 years ago. Beatrice Sutton's mother sat rigid with disapproval, her assessment of Eleanor clearly written in the tight line of her mouth, and the way her eyes travelled from Eleanor's unadorned hair to her flat chest to her scuffed shoes, with the kind of inventory that left no flaw uncatalogued. The ranch hands from Hartford Ranch filled the back pews, their weathered faces showing a range of reactions from genuine pleasure to puzzled concern. These men who knew Cole Hartford as a fair boss and a capable rancher, but who'd probably never imagined him choosing someone like Eleanor when he could have had his pick of the county's beauties. Reverend Matthews found his voice again, proceeding with the ceremony as if the interruption hadn't occurred. As if brides declared themselves too plain and grooms responded with cryptic reassurances every day in his chapel. "Do you, Cole Hartford, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Cole said, and his hand found Eleanor's, his grip warm and steady and somehow anchoring her to the moment when everything in her wanted to flee. "Do you, Eleanor Brennan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" The question hung in the air, and Eleanor realized that this was her last chance to refuse, to save them both from a marriage built on his desperation and her delusion. But when she opened her mouth, the word that emerged was yes, barely a whisper but legally binding all the same. Then by the power vested in me by the state of Texas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined together let no man put asunder. You may kiss your bride." Cole leaned down and pressed his lips to Eleanor's forehead. A chaste kiss that felt more like a blessing than a claiming, and Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she'd built around her heart to protect it from wanting things she couldn't have. The chapel erupted in polite applause, the sound echoing off the wooden beams overhead, and Eleanor found herself walking back down the aisle on Cole's arm, her hand tucked into the crook of his elbow, feeling the quality of his suit jacket under her work-roughened fingers, and wondering what she'd just agreed to, what life awaited her at Hartford Ranch, what it would mean to be wife to a man who'd chosen her not despite her plainness, but perhaps because of it, as if her very ordinariness made her safe in ways beauty never could. The reception at the Redemption Creek Community Hall proved to be exactly the ordeal Eleanor had anticipated, perhaps worse because the pity in people's eyes hurt more than their judgment would have. Women who'd never spoken to her beyond placing laundry orders suddenly appeared at her side with advice about wifely duties delivered in tones that suggested they doubted her capacity to fulfill them, while men clapped Cole on the shoulder with the hearty congratulations reserved for someone who'd made a practical if uninspiring choice, like buying a sturdy workhorse instead of a spirited thoroughbred. Mrs. Patterson had outdone herself with the food, tables laden with roasted chicken and fresh bread and 3 kinds of pie, but Eleanor could barely swallow past the knot in her throat, could barely smile through the endless parade of well-wishers whose eyes slid from Cole's face to hers with expressions ranging from confusion to something that looked disturbingly like schadenfreude. Beatrice Sutton held court near the punch bowl, her laughter ringing out like silver bells, her beauty enhanced rather than diminished by proximity to her plainer companions, and Eleanor caught her staring more than once with a look that suggested she was cataloguing every awkward moment for future retelling. Judge Morrison made a toast praising Cole's good sense in choosing a hard-working wife, the phrase hard-working landing with peculiar emphasis that made it clear what qualities Eleanor possessed, in lieu of more decorative attributes. And Eleanor smiled until her cheeks ached while dying inside. Cole remained at her side throughout, solid and present but not affectionate, performing his role as dutiful groom without any of the stolen glances or tender touches Eleanor had witnessed at other weddings. And she told herself she had no right to expect such things, that she'd entered this arrangement with open eyes and should be grateful for what she had rather than mourning what she'd never been promised. When Cole finally suggested they should depart for the ranch, Eleanor nearly wept with relief, gathering her few belongings, the carpet bag that held everything she owned in the world, and climbing into the wagon beside him for the hour-long journey that would take her away from the only home she'd known for 14 years toward a future she couldn't begin to imagine. The silence between them stretched uncomfortable and thick as the wagon rolled through the Texas countryside, the November sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that would have been beautiful if Eleanor had possessed the capacity to notice anything beyond her own churning thoughts. Hartford Ranch appeared gradually, first as a smudge on the horizon, then resolving into distinct shapes, a large ranch house built of native stone and timber, barns and outbuildings arranged with the kind of thoughtful planning that spoke to prosperity and good management, corrals holding horses that even Eleanor's untrained eye could recognize as quality stock, and everywhere the sense of a successful enterprise, a place that had been built with care and maintained with pride. Cole pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house, and Eleanor sat frozen, staring at what was now supposedly her home, this substantial dwelling that seemed to mock her inadequacy with every window and doorway. Mrs. Chen emerged onto the wide front porch, a woman of indeterminate age with silver threaded through her black hair and kind eyes that assessed Eleanor with the frank curiosity of someone trying to solve an unexpected puzzle. And Eleanor remembered that Cole had mentioned his housekeeper in passing, a widow who'd worked for his family since before his birth, and knew the workings of Hartford Ranch better than anyone. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hartford," the housekeeper said, and Eleanor flinched at the name that didn't feel like hers, that felt like a costume she'd put on without permission. But she managed a smile and a thank you that sounded steadier than she felt. Cole helped her down from the wagon with impersonal courtesy, his hands at her waist for the briefest moment before releasing her like she might burn him, and Eleanor followed him into the house carrying her pathetic carpet bag, while Mrs. Chen brought up the rear with a knowing expression that suggested she saw far more than Eleanor wished anyone to see. The interior of the house took Eleanor's breath away despite her determination not to be impressed. High ceilings with exposed beams, a massive stone fireplace dominating the main room, furniture that was simple but well made, everything speaking of comfort and permanence and a life built to last generations. Cole led her through the main floor, pointing out the kitchen where Mrs. Chen reigned supreme, the dining room with its long table that could seat a dozen, the parlour that looked strangely unused, and finally up the stairs to the second floor where 3 bedrooms opened off a central hallway. "This was my parents' room," Cole said, opening the first door to reveal a spacious chamber with a large bed covered in the wedding ring quilt Eleanor had so carefully mended. And she felt a strange jolt seeing her work in its intended place, the rings interlocking across the bed like a promise or an accusation. "This will be your room," he continued, opening the second door to a smaller but still generous chamber with a simple bed, a wardrobe, a washstand, and the windows that overlook the eastern pastures, the walls bare of decoration, the whole space having the abandoned quality of a room that hadn't been occupied in some time. Eleanor set down her carpet bag and turned to find Cole watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher, something that might have been apology or relief or regret. "Miss Brennan," he began, then stopped and corrected himself. "Eleanor, I should explain the full situation before we go any further." She waited, her hands clasped before her to hide their trembling, and Cole moved to stand by the window, his broad shoulders blocking the fading light as he spoke to the glass rather than to her. "My mother died 2 years ago this past spring," he said, his voice careful and controlled in a way that suggested strong emotion held rigidly in check. "And in her will she placed a condition on my inheritance of Hartford Ranch that I must marry before my 35th birthday, or the property would pass to my cousin Vincent, her sister's son, who she hoped might be reformed by responsibility, though I have my doubts on that score." Eleanor's stomach dropped, though she'd already suspected something of the sort, already known that Cole's proposal had been driven by necessity rather than desire. But hearing it stated so baldly still hurt in ways she hadn't prepared for. "My birthday is 3 weeks hence," Cole continued, turning to face her now, "and I'll be honest with you, Eleanor. I chose you not because I harbour romantic feelings. I'm not capable of such things. Not anymore, but because you struck me as sensible enough to understand a practical arrangement and strong enough to hold up your end of it without expecting poetry I have no capacity to provide." The words landed like blows, each one precise and devastating, and Eleanor felt her face grow hot with humiliation even as she recognised the brutal honesty for what it was, a kindness perhaps, a clarity that prevented false hopes from taking root. "I see," she managed, her voice steady through sheer force of will. "And what exactly would my end of this arrangement entail?" Cole seemed to relax slightly, as if her pragmatic response confirmed his assessment of her character, and he outlined the terms with the same care he might use negotiating a cattle purchase. "You would manage the household, oversee the domestic staff, though that's mainly just Mrs. Chen, represent Hartford Ranch at social functions as needed, and maintain the appearance of a legitimate marriage to satisfy the will's conditions. In return, you would have security, a home, an allowance for personal expenses, and my respect if not my affection. We would maintain separate bedrooms, and I would not impose any husbandly demands upon you that you might find unwelcome. It would be a partnership of convenience and mutual benefit, nothing more." "Nothing more," Eleanor repeated, and something in her chest that had been holding on to a fragile hope finally broke and released her to a strange kind of relief, because if this was only business, then she couldn't fail at being a wife in the ways she'd feared, couldn't disappoint expectations that didn't exist, couldn't be found lacking in areas where she'd never been asked to excel. "That seems fair," she heard herself say, "and I accept these terms. I'll do my best to fulfill my role and ask only that you continue the same honesty you've shown today, because I'd rather know where I stand than wonder." Cole's expression shifted to something that might have been approval, or perhaps just satisfaction at a negotiation concluded successfully, and he extended his hand for her to shake like she was a business partner rather than a bride, and Eleanor took it, their palms meeting in a grip that sealed their fate more surely than the vows they'd spoken in the chapel. "I'll leave you to settle in," Cole said, releasing her hand and moving toward the door. "Dinner is at 7 and Mrs. Chen is an excellent cook. We dress simply and keep early hours as ranch life demands. If you need anything, you can ask Mrs. Chen. She knows where everything is and has been managing this household since before I was born." He left before Eleanor could respond, his boots heavy on the wooden stairs, and she stood alone in her new room, feeling the weight of loneliness settle over her shoulders like a shawl she'd never be able to remove. The room was clean but impersonal, clearly prepared in haste, and Eleanor began unpacking her meagre possessions with mechanical precision, hanging her 3 dresses in the wardrobe, where they looked lost in all that empty space, arranging her hairbrush and pins on the washstand, placing her sewing kit on the small table by the window, where the light would be good for close work. Her entire life fit into this room with space left over, and the thought should have been depressing, but instead felt oddly liberating, as if she could become anyone in this empty space, could define herself by what she built here rather than what she'd been in Redemption Creek. She was exploring the room more thoroughly, opening drawers and finding them lined with fresh paper, when she discovered the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, its surface dusty enough to suggest it hadn't been opened in some time. Eleanor lifted the lid carefully, expecting linens or blankets, and instead found a collection of leather-bound journals stacked neatly inside, their covers worn soft with handling, and she lifted the top volume with trembling hands, opening it to the first page where elegant handwriting proclaimed, "This journal belongs to Catherine Miller Hartford, begun on the occasion of my marriage to James Hartford, May 15th, 1828. Cole's mother's journals, Eleanor realised, her heart hammering with the sense that she was trespassing on sacred ground, but unable to resist reading the first entry. "I married a stranger today," Catherine had written, "a man my father chose for practical reasons that have nothing to do with affection and everything to do with combining adjacent properties and strengthening business ties. James. Hartford is handsome enough and seems honourable, but there is no warmth between us, no tenderness, only a careful politeness that feels like walking on ice that might crack at any moment. I do not love him, and he does not love me, and I wonder if we ever shall. But I have made my choice and will honour it. Perhaps love is not necessary for a good life. Perhaps respect and duty are enough." Eleanor sank onto the bed, the journal open in her lap, reading those words from 50 years past and feeling a strange kinship with this woman she'd never met. This bride who'd also married a Hartford man under practical circumstances, who'd also wondered if respect and duty could substitute for love. She read on, entry after entry chronicling the early days of Catherine's marriage, the awkwardness and formality, the separate bedrooms and careful distance, the loneliness of sharing a house with someone who remained essentially a stranger. And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes because here was her own story told a generation before she'd lived it. But as she read further, turning pages with increasing urgency, she began to notice a shift in Catherine's entries, small changes that accumulated like interest in a bank account. "James brought me flowers from the south pasture today. Not roses or anything fancy, but wild flowers he must have picked himself. And when I thanked him, he looked pleased in a way that made me think perhaps he is not as indifferent as he pretends." Catherine wrote 3 months into her marriage, and a week later, "We worked together in the garden today, and I found myself laughing at something he said, truly laughing, not the polite chuckle I've been offering, but real amusement. And he smiled at me with such warmth that I felt my heart stutter. Perhaps there is hope for us after all." Eleanor read these entries with a hunger she didn't fully understand, watching Catherine's marriage was transformed from duty to something deeper, watching James Hartford reveal himself as more than the cold businessman Catherine had married, watching 2 strangers become partners and then friends, and then, eventually, something that looked remarkably like love. They had their struggles, Catherine's journals revealed, times when old patterns of distance reasserted themselves, conflicts over money and land management and the proper way to raise children when they finally came. But through it all ran a thread of growing connection, of 2 people choosing each day to build something together, rather than live parallel lives under the same roof. By the time Eleanor heard Mrs. Chen calling her for dinner, she'd read through the first journal and started the second, her eyes burning from the fading light and the tears she'd shed for Catherine's journey and perhaps for her own. She descended the stairs feeling strange, as if she'd been given a map to territory she hadn't known existed, and found Cole waiting in the dining room, his expression carefully neutral as he held out a chair, for her with automatic courtesy that probably came from his mother's instruction all those years ago. Mrs. Chen served them a meal that was indeed excellent, roasted beef with vegetables from the ranch garden, fresh bread that steamed when Eleanor broke it open, and a dried apple pie that tasted like comfort itself. But Eleanor barely noticed the food, too aware of Cole sitting across from her, this stranger who was now her husband, this man whose mother had also married a Hartford under practical circumstances and somehow found her way to happiness. They ate in silence for several minutes before Cole cleared his throat and asked if her room was satisfactory, and Eleanor assured him it was more than adequate. "Thank you." And the conversation died there, neither of them seeming to know how to bridge the chasm between polite strangers and actual companions. "I found your mother's journals," Eleanor said finally, desperate to fill the silence with something other than the clink of silverware. "I hope that's all right. They were in the cedar chest in my room, and I didn't mean to pry, but once I started reading, I couldn't seem to stop." Cole's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and something flickered across his face too quickly for Eleanor to identify, before his expression settled back into careful neutrality. "My mother was a great believer in the power of the written word," he said. "She kept journals her entire married life, recorded everything from household accounts to her private thoughts. I haven't been able to bring myself to read them since she died. It felt like an invasion even though she's gone, but if you found some value in them, then I'm glad. She would have wanted her words to be useful even after her death." Eleanor wanted to tell him what she'd learned from those journals, wanted to share the hope that had bloomed in her chest reading about a marriage that had started cold and grown warm. But she didn't know how to put it into words without revealing too much of her own foolish yearning, so instead she simply said, "She seemed like a remarkable woman, and your father too. They built something lasting together." Cole was quiet for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed on his plate, and when he spoke his voice carried a weight of old grief. "They did," he agreed. "Though it wasn't always easy. My father could be a hard man, demanding and sometimes cruel in his honesty. But my mother had a way of gentling him without diminishing him, of holding her ground while still making space for his rough edges. I watched them my whole childhood, and never quite understood how they did it, how they took what should have been a disaster of a marriage and turned it into something that worked, something that lasted." Eleanor heard the confusion in his voice, the sense that he'd witnessed a miracle without understanding its mechanics, and she realized that Cole had perhaps learned the wrong lessons from his parents' marriage, had seen the careful distance they'd started with and assumed it was meant to be maintained rather than overcome, had inherited his father's rough edges without his mother's gift for gentling them. The rest of the meal passed in more silence, comfortable enough but tinged with melancholy, and afterward Cole excused himself to check on some ranch business, while Eleanor helped Mrs. Chen clear the dishes despite the housekeeper's protests. "You don't need to be doing such work, Mrs. Hartford," the older woman said. "You're mistress of this house now." But Eleanor couldn't bear the thought of sitting idle in the parlour like a lady of leisure when her hands knew how to be useful, so she insisted, and Mrs. Chen relented with a knowing look that suggested she understood more than Eleanor wished. That night Eleanor returned to her room and the journals, reading by lamplight until her eyes burned and the words began to blur, searching Catherine's experiences for clues to her own future, for evidence that marriages of convenience could become something more, for permission to hope even when hope seemed foolish. She read about the first time Catherine and James had truly talked rather than simply exchanged pleasantries, a conversation that happened during a thunderstorm when fear had stripped away their careful facades and left them raw and honest with each other, and Eleanor wondered what it would take to strip away the careful facades between herself and Cole, what storm might force them into the kind of honesty that built connection rather than maintaining distance. She read about the first time Catherine had felt desire for her husband, a shocking entry that made Eleanor's cheeks burn even alone in her room, and the gradual evolution of their separate bedrooms into a shared one, the physical intimacy that followed emotional connection rather than preceding it, and Eleanor felt a strange yearning for something she'd never experienced, never even imagined might be available to someone like her. She read about the births of Catherine's 3 children, 2 sons who'd died in childhood of scarlet fever, and a daughter who'd died at 16 in a riding accident, and the way grief had either broken marriages or forged them stronger depending on whether the couple faced it together or separately, and Eleanor wept for these children she'd never known, and for Cole who'd lost his siblings before he was old enough to remember them clearly. She read about Catherine's fears that she was failing as a wife, as a mother, as a woman, entries that could have been pulled from Eleanor's own heart, and the way James had reassured her not with pretty words but with steadfast presence, with showing up day after day even when it would have been easier to retreat into work or drink or any of the other escapes men found when domestic life became difficult. Finally, exhausted and emotionally wrung out, Eleanor closed the journal and extinguished her lamp, lying in the darkness of her new room in her new life, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the creak of floorboards as Cole moved around in his room down the hall, She was married to a man who'd chosen her for her sensibility, who valued her competence but expected nothing resembling love, who'd been clear about the boundaries of their arrangement and seemed content to maintain them indefinitely, and she should be grateful for the security and honesty if nothing else. But lying there in the dark with Catherine's words fresh in her mind, Eleanor couldn't help wondering if marriages that started cold might warm with time, if two sensible people choosing to build a life together might find something unexpected, growing in the space between duty and desire, if she might somehow write her own story that echoed Catherine's journey from stranger to partner to something more. It was a foolish hope, perhaps, born of loneliness and the romantic notion that history might repeat itself, but as sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor held on to it like a candle in the dark, a small flame that might guide her through the strange territory of a marriage that was real in law but not yet in heart. The weeks following her arrival at Hartford Ranch passed in a blur of purposeful activity, as Eleanor channeled the ache of her practical marriage into the kind of work that had always been her refuge and salvation, rising before dawn to help Mrs. Chen prepare breakfast, spending her days transforming the household from merely functional to genuinely efficient, her evenings reading Catherine's journals by lamplight and finding both comfort and instruction in the dead woman's recorded wisdom. She started with the kitchen, reorganizing the pantry according to a system that made sense to her orderly mind, grouping items by use rather than by type, creating an inventory list that would prevent waste and ensure they never ran short of essentials. And Mrs. Chen had been skeptical at first, but grudgingly admitted after a week that the new arrangement saved considerable time and effort. Eleanor moved through the house like a quiet storm, not changing things for the sake of change, but identifying inefficiencies and correcting them, rearranging furniture to maximize light and airflow, mending curtains that had been left torn for months, polishing silver that had tarnished from neglect, and slowly the house began to feel less like a place where a man existed and more like a home where people might actually live. She noticed that the ranch hands ate their meals in the bunkhouse, their children running half wild with no schooling beyond what their tired mothers could provide after long days of work, and Eleanor felt a familiar pull toward the kind of usefulness that had defined her life in Redemption Creek. She approached Cole one evening after supper, her heart hammering with nervousness because she still didn't know how to talk to this man who was her husband in name only, and asked if he would mind if she started a small school for the children. Nothing formal but basic reading and arithmetic, perhaps 2 hours each afternoon in the unused parlour. Cole had looked up from the ranch accounts he was studying, his grey eyes reflecting the lamplight, and for a moment Eleanor thought he would refuse, would tell her that ranch children didn't need book learning, but instead he'd said that it seemed a fine idea, and if she needed supplies she should add them to the household account. And Eleanor had retreated before he could change his mind, her chest tight with something that felt almost like gratitude. The school started small, just 3 children at first, the daughters of the head wrangler and the son of the man who managed the cattle operation. But word spread, and within 2 weeks Eleanor had 8 students ranging in age from 5 to 12, their eager faces a balm to her lonely heart. She taught them letters and numbers, reading from the few books she'd brought with her, and from volumes she discovered in Cole's surprisingly extensive library, and she found that teaching gave her a purpose beyond household management, made her feel valuable in ways that went beyond mere utility. The children adored her with the uncomplicated affection of young people who recognized genuine care when they received it, and Eleanor bloomed under their attention, her smiles coming more easily, her posture straightening with confidence. She noticed one morning that the kitchen garden behind the house had been neglected, the soil good but unworked, and Eleanor felt her fingers itch with the desire to dig and plant and create something beautiful from bare earth. She'd always loved growing things, had maintained a small herb garden behind the boarding house in Redemption Creek, and here she had space to truly experiment, to build something substantial. She started clearing the plot in her spare moments, pulling weeds and turning soil, and one afternoon Cole appeared with a team and plough, his sleeves rolled up and his hat pulled low, and without a word he broke the ground for her, preparing the beds while Eleanor watched with her heart in her throat at this unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she'd managed when he finished, and he'd shrugged like it was nothing. Like husbands helped wives with garden plots every day, even when their marriages were practical arrangements that forbade emotional attachment. And for the rest of the day, Eleanor had moved through her tasks with a lightness she couldn't entirely explain. She ordered seeds from a catalogue Mrs. Chen had saved, exotic varieties that promised unusual flavours and impressive yields, and she planted them with the same care she'd once used on the wedding ring quilt, each seed placed with intention and hope. The garden became her meditation and her pride, a place where she could work with her hands and see immediate results, where beauty and utility combined in ways that satisfied something deep in her soul. And as the weeks passed and green shoots emerged from the dark earth, Eleanor felt like she too was emerging from some long dormant state, finding sunlight and space to grow. The chickens were almost an accident, or perhaps an inevitability given Eleanor's need to be useful in every possible way. She'd noticed that the ranch bought eggs from a supplier in town at prices that seemed excessive given how easy chickens were to keep. And she'd mentioned this to Cole, who'd agreed, but said he'd never gotten around to establishing a flock because his mother had kept chickens, and after her death no one wanted to take on the task. Eleanor had asked if she might try, expecting resistance, but Cole had simply told her to order whatever she needed and charge it to the ranch account, and within a week Eleanor had 24 laying hens and a rooster in a newly constructed coop built by ranch hands, who seemed bemused but willing to follow her precise specifications. She didn't just keep chickens, she studied them with the same intensity she brought to everything, reading articles in farming journals about breeding and nutrition and optimal laying conditions, experimenting with different feeds and documenting the results in a careful ledger. She discovered that certain combinations of grains increased both egg production and quality, that particular breeds handled the Texas heat better than others, that rotating where the chickens foraged improved both their health and the soil. Within 2 months, Hartford Ranch had not only stopped buying eggs, but started selling them. Eleanor's flock producing enough surplus to supply 3 restaurants in town and 2 neighboring ranches, the income modest but steady and entirely due to her innovation and effort. Cole had looked at her ledger one evening with an expression she couldn't quite read, his finger tracing down the columns of numbers that showed costs and revenues and pure profit, and when he'd looked up at her, there was something in his eyes that might have been respect or admiration or simple surprise that she was capable of generating income rather than merely spending it. "You have a head for this," he'd said, and Eleanor had felt a flush of pride so intense it almost frightened her, because his approval mattered in ways it shouldn't given their arrangement, mattered more than all the compliments she'd never received about her appearance. The crisis with Maria Santos came without warning, as crises generally did, when the young wife of one of the ranch hands developed a fever that spiked so high she began hallucinating, crying out in Spanish about demons and death, while her terrified husband begged someone to help. The nearest doctor was in Redemption Creek, an hour's ride away, and Eleanor knew from experience that fevers like this could kill quickly, could take a healthy woman and turn her into a corpse in less than a day if not treated aggressively. She'd learned nursing from necessity, caring for sick boarders at Mrs. Chen's establishment, and she moved into the Santos cottage without hesitation, bringing the knowledge Catherine's journals had provided about fever management and the practical experience she'd gained through years of making herself useful. She stripped Maria to her chemise despite the woman's husband's shocked protests, packed her in cool cloths, forced willow bark tea down her throat sip by painful sip, stayed up for 36 hours straight monitoring her temperature and adjusting her treatment, and when the fever finally broke and Maria opened her eyes clear and lucid, Eleanor had to leave the room quickly before anyone saw her cry with relief. The Santos family had no money to pay her, but Carlos Santos carved her a beautiful wooden box for her seeds, and his wife, once recovered, insisted on teaching Eleanor how to make proper corn tortillas, and Eleanor accepted both gifts with gratitude that had nothing to do with their monetary value and everything to do with being seen, being valued, being necessary in ways that fed her starving heart. Word spread through the ranch and then into town about how Eleanor had saved Maria Santos, how she'd nursed the young mother through a fever that would have killed her without intervention, and suddenly the women who'd pitied her at the wedding began seeking her advice about their own ailments, their children's mysterious rashes, their husbands' persistent coughs. Eleanor found herself becoming the unofficial medical advisor to Hartford Ranch and its surroundings, a role she'd never sought but filled with the same competence she brought to everything. And she added medical supplies to the household account, building a small pharmacy of remedies and treatments that she dispensed with careful instructions and genuine concern. Cole watched all of this from a distance, or so Eleanor thought, not realizing that he was observing her transformation with increasing fascination, noticing things about his practical wife that he had never expected to notice. He saw how the ranch hand's children followed her like ducklings, their faces bright with the knowledge that someone cared whether they could read or cipher. He saw how her garden grew lush and abundant, how she worked the soil with a tenderness that spoke to something deeper than mere horticulture, how she saved seeds and planned for future seasons like someone who expected to be here to see them. He saw how she moved through the house with increasing confidence, her initial tentativeness replaced by a quiet authority that made even Mrs. Chen defer to her judgment. How she'd transformed their residence from a place he slept into something that felt almost like the home his mother had created before grief and death had emptied it. He noticed small things, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating on difficult tasks, how her freckles darkened as she spent more time in the sun, the surprising strength in her thin arms when she carried water buckets or bags of feed, the flash of genuine joy on her face when her students mastered a difficult concept or when a plant she'd worried about produced fruit. He noticed that she mended his clothes without being asked, that his favourite work shirt appeared in his wardrobe with its torn pocket perfectly repaired, the stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and he found himself wondering what it meant that she paid attention to such details, whether it was mere wifely duty or something more. Small moments of connection began to accumulate like coins in a jar, individually insignificant but collectively substantial. Cole brought her seeds one day, special varieties he'd ordered from a supplier in San Antonio, tomatoes that supposedly grew well in heat and peppers that would add flavour to Mrs. Chen's cooking, and he'd presented them awkwardly, not sure if it was appropriate to give gifts to a wife he'd married for convenience, but Eleanor's face had lit with such genuine delight that he'd felt something warm unfurl in his chest, something he'd thought died with his mother. Their hands brushed during supper one evening, when they both reached for the salt cellar simultaneously, and the contact sent a jolt through Cole that was entirely inappropriate given their arrangement, made him suddenly aware of Eleanor in ways he'd been carefully avoiding, the graceful movement of her fingers, the curve of her neck where it met her shoulder, the soft sound of her breathing in the quiet room. He pulled back quickly, mumbling an apology, but their eyes met for a heartbeat and he saw something in hers, surprise maybe, or awareness, or the same unwelcome attraction he was feeling, before they both looked away and pretended nothing had happened. Eleanor felt it too, these moments of unexpected connection, and they confused her because she'd accepted the terms of their marriage, had made peace with a life of respected companionship rather than romantic love, but her body and heart seemed not to have received that message. She found herself watching Cole when he didn't know she was looking, admiring the capable way he handled horses, the patient tone he used when teaching a young ranch hand a new skill, the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun and occasionally laughing hard enough to crease the skin permanently. She noticed that he smelled of leather and sage and something else, indefinably masculine, that made her pulse quicken in ways she'd never experienced, and she felt shame at her reaction because surely he'd be horrified to know his plain practical wife harboured such inappropriate feelings. The town's opinion of Eleanor began shifting as evidence of her competence became impossible to ignore. Women who'd pitied her now seeking her advice, men who'd thought Cole had made a poor choice now acknowledging that Eleanor Hartford was proving herself a valuable asset to the Sorrel Ranch and community. Mrs. Patterson made a point of telling everyone who shopped at her store about Eleanor's remarkable garden and her innovative chicken breeding program. Judge Morrison's wife sought Eleanor's help with a persistent cough and then praised her medical knowledge to anyone who would listen, and gradually the narrative changed from poor Cole Hartford, married to that plain creature, to perhaps Cole Hartford knew what he was doing after all, that Brennan woman has turned out to be quite capable. But not everyone was pleased with Eleanor's rising status, and Beatrice Sutton in particular seemed to take personal offence at the idea that Eleanor might be valued for anything other than her utility as a housekeeper. Beatrice had expected Eleanor to fail spectacularly, to prove herself inadequate to the role of rancher's wife, to be cast aside so that Cole might realise his mistake and choose someone more suitable, someone beautiful and accomplished and worthy of the Hartford name. When this didn't happen, when Eleanor instead thrived and earned genuine respect from the community, Beatrice responded the only way she knew how, with vicious rumours designed to tear down what she couldn't achieve herself. She started slowly, little comments here and there about how convenient it was that Eleanor had trapped Cole just when he needed a wife to satisfy his mother's will. How suspicious the timing was, how obviously calculated Eleanor's pursuit had been. She embroidered the story with details that sounded plausible if you didn't know the truth, suggesting that Eleanor had deliberately damaged the wedding quilt so it would need extensive repairs, creating opportunities to catch Cole's attention, that she'd manipulated a grieving son's emotions about his mother to secure a proposal, that the whole thing was a scheme worthy of the most mercenary fortune hunter. The rumours spread because rumours always did, especially when they came wrapped in Beatrice's honeyed voice and beautiful face, and eventually they reached Eleanor through Mrs. Chen, who felt she had a duty to inform her mistress what was being said in town. Eleanor listened with her face carefully composed, her hands busy with some mending that didn't really need her attention, and when Mrs. Chen finished, she simply thanked her for the information and returned to her work as if the words hadn't cut deep into her already fragile sense of belonging. That night, she lay in her bed staring at the ceiling and wondering if the rumours bothered her because they were false, or because part of her wished she'd been clever enough to trap Cole deliberately, to secure through feminine wiles what she'd actually received through his desperation. And the thought that she might have wanted to manipulate him made her feel sick with self-loathing. She almost didn't tell Cole about the rumours, pride preventing her from showing how much Beatrice's poison had affected her, but they'd promised each other honesty, and Eleanor felt that breaking that promise would be worse than admitting her hurt. She approached him the next evening as he sat on the front porch reviewing breeding records, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and she forced herself to speak calmly, even though her heart was racing. "Cole, there are rumours in town," she began, and he looked up with immediate attention, his grey eyes sharpening with concern. "Beatrice Sutton has been telling people that I trapped you into marriage, that I deliberately created opportunities to catch your attention, that our whole arrangement was my scheme to secure a wealthy husband." She'd expected anger or dismissal, but Cole's reaction surprised her, his face darkening not with rage, but with something that looked like guilt. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "Eleanor, I'm sorry," he said, standing and moving to the porch rail where he gripped the wood like it might anchor him. "I should have anticipated this, should have realised that my sudden marriage to someone to you would create talk, should have protected you from this kind of speculation." "It's not your responsibility to protect me from gossip," Eleanor said, though her heart lifted at the idea that he might want to. "I just thought you should know what's being said in case it affects the ranch's reputation or your standing in the community." "Damn the ranch's reputation and my standing," Cole said with surprising vehemence, turning to face her fully. "You've done nothing but improve both since you arrived. Anyone with eyes can see that. And if Beatrice Sutton wants to spread lies because she's bitter that I chose competence over beauty, then that says everything about her character and nothing about yours." The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Eleanor was afraid to examine too closely, because Cole had just said he'd chosen her. Not that circumstances had forced her on him, but that he'd made an active selection, and the distinction felt monumental, even if she was reading too much into his phrasing. "I'll speak to her," Cole continued. "Make it clear that such rumours are unacceptable, and—" "No," Eleanor interrupted. "Please don't. That will only make things worse, make it seem like we're defensive, because the accusations hold truth. The best response to lies is to live honestly and let our actions speak for themselves." Cole studied her face in the fading light, his expression complex and shifting, and finally he nodded. "You're right, of course, you're wiser about these things than I am, but Eleanor, I want you to know that I don't believe for a moment that you manipulated me. I made my choice with open eyes and I've had no cause to regret it. You've exceeded every expectation I had and created value I never thought to expect. This ranch is better with you in it, and so is my life." Eleanor's throat closed with emotion she couldn't express, couldn't acknowledge without breaking the careful boundaries of their arrangement, so she simply nodded and murmured thank you, and fled inside before he could see the tears that threatened to spill. Because if he kept saying things like that, she might start believing that their marriage could become something more than a practical convenience, might start hoping for things she had no right to want. The months continued to pass, and Eleanor's transformation of Hartford Ranch accelerated. Her garden producing vegetables that made Mrs. Chen's cooking legendary among the ranch hands, her chickens generating enough income to pay for their feed 3 times over and still turn a profit, her school expanding to include a dozen children whose parents blessed her name for giving their offspring opportunities they'd never had. Cole watched her bloom like one of her carefully tended plants, watched her grow confident and purposeful, watched her laugh with the children and negotiate with suppliers and nurse the sick and manage the household with effortless competence, and he found himself thinking about her odd moments during his workday, wondering what she was doing, whether her garden was thriving, if she'd discovered anything interesting in his mother's journals that she continued to read each night. He began finding excuses to be near her, checking on the chicken coop when he knew she'd be collecting eggs, reviewing household accounts when she was working on her ledgers, taking his coffee on the front porch when she usually tended her morning garden work, and if Mrs. Chen noticed his suddenly increased interest in domestic matters, she was wise enough not to comment, though he sometimes caught her smiling knowingly. One afternoon, Cole discovered Eleanor in the barn attempting to move a heavy bag of chicken feed, her face red with effort and her thin arms trembling, and he took the bag from her without a word, carrying it to the coop while she followed with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "You should have asked for help," he said, not as criticism but as concern. "You'll hurt yourself trying to move things that heavy," and Eleanor had replied that she'd always moved her own supplies and didn't want to be a burden on the ranch hands who had their own work. And Cole had stopped walking and turned to face her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Eleanor, you're not a burden. You're my wife and the mistress of this ranch, and asking for help when you need it isn't weakness. It's wisdom, and I'd rather you asked than injured yourself trying to prove you don't need anyone." The words resonated with something deep in Eleanor's understanding, because that's exactly what she'd been doing her whole life, proving she didn't need anyone, proving she could handle everything alone, building walls of competence to protect herself from the vulnerability of depending on others. And here was Cole telling her that those walls weren't necessary, at least not with him, at least not here. Their eyes met and held, something passing between them that was more than respect and less than love, but definitely something, an awareness, a possibility, a crack in the careful boundaries they'd established. And Eleanor felt her heart hammer with hope and fear in equal measure, because if she let herself want more than what they'd agreed to, if she let herself hope for affection or tenderness or heaven forbid love, and he couldn't or wouldn't give it, the rejection would destroy her in ways Beatrice Sutton's rumours never could. They stood there in the barn with dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunlight, and chickens clucking softly in their coop, and the smell of hay and animals and earth surrounding them. And Cole reached out slowly, giving Eleanor time to pull away, and tucked a strand of her copper hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin, and the gesture was so tender, so utterly at odds with their practical arrangement, that Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes even as she leaned infinitesimally into his touch. Then a ranch hand called Cole's name from across the yard, and the moment shattered, both of them stepping back and looking away and mumbling about tasks that needed attention. But as Eleanor watched Cole walk toward whatever crisis required his attention, she pressed her hand to her cheek where his fingers had touched, and wondered if marriages of convenience ever transformed into something more. If Catherine's journals had given her false hope or true prophecy, if the careful distance between herself and Cole was protecting them both or preventing something precious from growing in the space between duty and desire, Vincent Hartford arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, riding up the long drive in a rented carriage with leather trunk strapped to the back and an air of dissolute charm that made Eleanor's skin prickle with instinctive distrust even before Cole's entire body went rigid at the sight of his cousin. Vincent was handsome in the way that warned sensible people to guard their valuables and their daughters, his dark hair slicked back with pomade, his clothes expensive but slightly rumpled, his smile quick and insincere, and when he climbed down from the carriage and turned to help his companion emerge, Eleanor felt her stomach drop because of course Beatrice Sutton would be with him, of course these two would have found each other, like poison recognizing poison. "Cousin Cole!" Vincent called out with false heartiness, extending his hand for a shake that Cole accepted with obvious reluctance. "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. Beatrice and I were passing through on our way to Houston, and I simply had to stop and meet your new bride. Make sure my dear cousin hasn't been taken advantage of by some scheming fortune hunter." The words were spoken with a laugh as if they were a joke, but Eleanor heard the barb beneath them, saw the calculation in Vincent's eyes as he assessed her with the kind of thorough inventory she'd learned to expect from people who valued appearance above substance, and she watched his smile sharpen when he apparently found her wanting in every measurable category of feminine appeal. "Mrs. Hartford, what a pleasure," Vincent said, taking her hand and bowing over it with exaggerated courtesy that mocked the gesture even as he performed it. "Cole has been keeping you quite secret. We'd all begun to wonder if you actually existed, or if he'd invented a wife to satisfy his mother's ridiculous will." Eleanor extracted her hand as quickly as politeness allowed, her cheeks burning because Vincent had just announced in his opening remarks that he knew exactly why Cole had married, and suspected the union wasn't genuine, and she glanced at Cole to find his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Beatrice drifted forward then, beautiful as always in a travelling dress of deep blue that made her eyes luminous, her golden curls artfully arranged, her rosebud mouth curved in a smile that held all the warmth of a snake's kiss, and she embraced Eleanor with false affection that allowed her to whisper in her ear, "I told Vincent all about you, dear Eleanor, about your little arrangement with Cole. I do hope we can all be honest with each other now that we're practically family." The visit that Eleanor had hoped might last an hour stretched into dinner when Vincent announced they'd stay the night. Of course they would. Family didn't impose on family, and surely Cole wouldn't send his own cousin to sleep in a hotel when Hartford Ranch had plenty of room. And Cole had agreed through gritted teeth because refusing would have created exactly the kind of scene Vincent was clearly hoping to provoke. Mrs. Chen prepared a meal that should have been pleasant: roasted chicken and fresh vegetables from Eleanor's garden, and a pie made with preserved peaches, but the food turned to ash in Eleanor's mouth as she sat across from Beatrice and tried to ignore the woman's pointed comments about how quaint the house was, how rustic, how surprising that Cole hadn't updated the furnishings when he could clearly afford something more fashionable. Vincent dominated the conversation with stories of his travels, each anecdote designed to highlight his sophistication and worldliness, while implying that Cole had buried himself in rural obscurity, and he peppered his monologue with questions that seemed innocent but carried hidden blades, asking how Cole and Eleanor had met, how long they'd courted, whether they planned to have children soon, because surely that was the whole point of marriage. Cole answered in monosyllables, his face a mask of barely controlled anger, while Eleanor tried to deflect with vague pleasantries, but Vincent was relentless, circling their vulnerabilities like a wolf testing a fence for weaknesses. "Tell me, Eleanor," Vincent said as Mrs. Chen served dessert, "have you always lived in Redemption Creek? I confess I know almost nothing about you except that you appeared quite suddenly in Cole's life at a very convenient moment." Eleanor felt the trap closing but couldn't see how to escape it, so she answered honestly that yes, she'd lived in Redemption Creek since childhood, worked as a laundress and seamstress, had no family to speak of and no fortune beyond what her hands could earn, and she watched Vincent's eyes gleam with satisfaction at each admission of her ordinariness, her poverty, her complete unsuitability to be the wife of the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. "How wonderfully practical," Vincent said, glancing at Cole with exaggerated approval. "You've married someone who understands the value of hard work. Though I confess I'm curious about the timing. You've been eligible for years, and suddenly you marry within weeks of your 35th birthday, the exact deadline specified in Aunt Catherine's will. What extraordinary coincidence." The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Cole's fork clattered against his plate with enough force that everyone jumped, his grey eyes blazing with fury as he stared at his cousin across the babble. "Say what you mean, Vincent," Cole growled. Stop dancing around your insinuations and speak plainly if you have something to say." Vincent's smile widened, his handsome face alight with malicious pleasure, and he leaned back in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who held all the cards and knew it. "I'm merely observing that your marriage seems designed to satisfy the letter of our aunt's will, rather than the spirit," he said smoothly. "And I've been reviewing that will quite carefully these past months, had my lawyer examine it for any ambiguities or loopholes, and he found something quite interesting in the specific language Aunt Catherine used." Eleanor felt cold dread settle in her stomach because she'd read Catherine's will in one of the journals, had seen the marriage clause that required Cole to wed before 35, but she'd never imagined there might be additional conditions, hidden requirements that could invalidate everything they'd built. "The will doesn't simply require marriage," Vincent continued, clearly savouring each word. "It requires, and I quote, a true union blessed by family continuation within 2 years of the wedding date, which my lawyer interprets to mean that you must not only marry but produce an heir within that time frame, or the ranch reverts to me as the next male Hartford in line." The silence that followed was absolute, even Beatrice having the grace to look slightly uncomfortable with Vincent's calculated cruelty, and Eleanor felt the room tilt around her as she understood the full implications of what he'd just revealed. "Cole and I have been married barely 3 months," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "Surely 2 years is sufficient time to—" "Oh, but that's just it," Vincent interrupted with false sympathy. 2 years from the wedding date means you have only 21 months remaining, and given that pregnancy takes 9 months and these things aren't always successful on the first attempt, time is rather pressing, assuming of course that you're actually attempting, which brings me to my real concern." He paused for effect, his eyes moving between Cole and Eleanor with clinical assessment, and when he spoke again his voice carried the sharp edge of accusation beneath the smooth surface. "I have reason to believe your marriage isn't consummated, that you maintain separate bedrooms, that this entire arrangement is a legal fiction designed to circumvent Aunt Catherine's clear intent that the ranch should pass to someone who would build a family here, carry on the Hartford name, create the dynasty she envisioned, And if that's true, then the marriage is invalid regardless of the timeline, a sham that should be set aside so the property can pass to someone who will actually honour her wishes. Eleanor pushed back from the table so abruptly, her chair scraped against the floor, unable to sit there another moment while Vincent dissected her marriage and her inadequacies for public consumption, and she fled from the dining room with as much dignity as she could muster while her world crumbled around her. She heard Cole call her name, but didn't stop, couldn't stop, needed air and space and somewhere to hide from the humiliation that threatened to drown her. And she found herself in her garden, the one place on the ranch that was entirely hers, where her hands had created beauty and her work had meaning. She sank onto the wooden bench Cole had built for her last month, a thoughtful gesture she'd treasured because it suggested he noticed what she needed, even when she didn't ask, and she pressed her hands to her face and tried to breathe through the panic rising in her chest like floodwater. The garden was just beginning its spring growth, tender shoots pushing through the soil she'd prepared with such care, the promise of abundance still weeks away but visible to anyone who knew how to look. And Eleanor found herself wondering if any of it mattered. If all her work and planning and careful tending would be for nothing if Vincent succeeded in taking the ranch, if she'd be cast out to return to Redemption Creek with nothing but the reputation of a failed wife who couldn't even manage the basic requirement of consummating her marriage. She heard footsteps on the path and knew without looking that Cole had followed her, could recognize his gait and the particular way he moved through space, and she didn't turn around even when he sat beside her on the bench, his solid presence both comfort and torment, because how could she explain to him that Vincent's cruel assessment had simply voiced the fears she carried every day, the knowledge that she was inadequate, that their arrangement was unsustainable, that eventually reality would intrude on their careful pretense and destroy everything. "Eleanor," Cole said quietly, his voice rough, with emotion she couldn't interpret, "I'm sorry, I should have warned you about Vincent, should have anticipated that he'd come sniffing around looking for weaknesses, should have protected you from that display of calculated malice." "It's not your fault," Eleanor managed, her hands still pressed to her face because she couldn't bear to look at him, couldn't stand to see pity or regret or worst of all agreement with Vincent's assessment in his eyes. He's right though, isn't he? Our marriage is exactly what he said, a legal fiction, a practical arrangement that doesn't meet the spirit of your mother's wishes, and No, Cole interrupted, his voice sharp enough that Eleanor finally looked up at him, and she was startled to find his grey eyes blazing not with anger at her, but with something fiercer, something that looked almost like pain. "My mother's wishes were complicated and not entirely rational given her own experience," he said, his hands clenched into fists on his knees, "and I need to tell you something about my parents' marriage, something I should have explained before we wed but couldn't find the words, something that might help you understand why I've maintained distance when perhaps distance was the last thing either of us needed." Eleanor waited, her heart hammering, and Cole took a deep breath before speaking again, his words coming slowly as if each one cost him something to voice. "My father loved my mother," he said, staring out at the garden rather than at Eleanor, "loved her desperately from the moment he met her. But my mother was not beautiful by conventional standards. She was plain-like." He stopped, seemed to reconsider his phrasing. "She had features similar to yours, freckled and thin and practical looking, and my father, God help him, could not reconcile his love for her with society's judgment of her appearance, could not stop noticing other men's beautiful wives, could not prevent himself from making little comments about how she might improve herself, how she might arrange her hair differently, or wear colours that flattered her colouring better, how she might gain weight to fill out her dresses more appealingly." The words fell like stones into still water, each one sending ripples of understanding through Eleanor's mind, and she began to see the shape of something she'd missed in Catherine's journals, the shadow beneath the love story she'd been reading. "He never meant to be cruel," Cole continued, his voice thick with old grief and anger. "He genuinely thought he was helping, thought that if she could just make herself more beautiful, then he could love her without the shame he felt when other men looked at his plain wife with pity. But his suggestions were like poison, each one reinforcing that she wasn't enough, that her value depended on changing herself into someone she fundamentally wasn't. And I watched her shrink under his attention, watched her stop smiling, stop laughing, stop being the vibrant woman she'd been before his. Love started eroding her sense of worth." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks as she understood not just Cole's father's cruelty, but Cole's terror, his determination never to repeat that pattern, his choice of distance over the risk of inflicting similar wounds, and suddenly their entire arrangement made terrible, heartbreaking sense. She loved him anyway, Cole said, and now his voice broke slightly. Loved him until the day she died, forgave him every careless comment and wounding observation, tried to become what he wanted even though it was killing her by inches, and when she finally wrote her will, she included that marriage clause. Not because she wanted me to find love, but because she wanted me to have what she had, to build a family despite the pain, to not let fear of hurting someone prevent me from trying. But Eleanor, I learned the wrong lesson from watching them. I learned that love and beauty were incompatible, that caring about someone's appearance led inevitably to cruelty, that the only way to avoid becoming my father was to marry someone I wouldn't be tempted to criticize, someone whose plainness would protect both of us from that particular kind of destruction. The word plainness should have hurt but didn't, not anymore. Not when Eleanor could hear beneath it Cole's desperate attempt to protect her, to shield her from the cruelty his father had inflicted on his mother, to choose safety over passion because he'd seen where passion led when mixed with society's impossible beauty standards. But I was wrong, Cole said, finally turning to look at Eleanor directly, his grey eyes shining with unshed tears. Wrong to think that distance would protect you. Wrong to believe that not caring about your appearance meant I couldn't hurt you. Wrong to imagine that a marriage without intimacy could somehow be safer than one with it. Because Vincent's cruelty tonight proves that I've hurt you anyway, left you vulnerable in different ways, failed to give you the protection and partnership you deserved when you've given me everything, transformed my house into a home, my ranch into something more profitable, my life into something that feels less empty than it did before you arrived. Eleanor couldn't speak around the lump in her throat, couldn't process the enormity of what Cole was confessing, the layers of fear and trauma and misguided protection that had shaped their marriage, and she felt her own walls crumbling, the careful defenses she'd built against hope and wanting and the dangerous territory of actual feeling. "I need to tell you something too," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Something I realized reading your mother's journals, something about beauty and worth and the lies we tell ourselves to survive being ordinary in a world that values only the extraordinary." She took a breath, gathering courage, and forced herself to continue even though every word felt like exposing a wound. "I've spent my entire life believing I was too plain to deserve love," she said, "that men like you married women like me only when desperate circumstances left no better choice, that my value lay entirely in my usefulness and competence because those were the only currencies I possessed. And when you proposed, I accepted because I thought a practical marriage to a man who saw me as a convenient solution was the best I could hope for, the closest I would ever come to having a partner and a home, and maybe eventually children if we managed to overcome our mutual indifference long enough to fulfill your mother's requirements." Cole flinched at that, pain crossing his face, but Eleanor pressed on because if they were finally being honest, then she needed to say everything, needed to lance this wound completely before it could heal crooked. "But these past months have taught me something your mother's journals prepared me to understand," she said, her tears flowing freely now, "that beauty isn't what I thought it was, that the things I saw as flaws might actually be evidence of a life lived fully, that my freckles come from working in the sun to feed people, that my thin frame reflects years of making sure others ate before I did, that my work-roughened hands have created and mended and healed, and maybe that's not the kind of beauty that launches ships or inspires poetry, but it's real, and it matters, and it's mine." She paused, looking directly at Cole, willing him to understand what she was trying to say. "And I've also learned that I don't want a marriage of convenience anymore," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I want what your parents had before your father's cruelty poisoned it. I want partnership and intimacy and, yes, even love if such a thing is possible between two people who married for practical reasons. I want to be seen not just for what I can do but for who I am. I want to be wanted, not just needed. And I know that's not what we agreed to, know that asking for more might destroy what we've built, but Vincent's arrival has made it clear that pretending we can maintain careful distance isn't protecting either of us. It's just leaving us vulnerable to different kinds of pain. The silence that followed felt enormous, weighted with possibility and terror in equal measure, and Eleanor held her breath waiting for Cole to reject her confession, to remind her of their arrangement's boundaries, to choose safety over the risk she was proposing. But instead he reached out slowly and took her hand in his calloused palm warm against her work-roughened fingers, and when he spoke his voice was raw with emotion. "I see you, Eleanor," he said, and the words unlocked something in her chest that had been frozen since childhood. "I see how you've transformed this ranch, How you teach those children with patience I could never muster. How you nurse the sick and negotiate with suppliers and manage the household with effortless competence. But I also see how you bite your lip when you're concentrating, how your freckles darken in the sun, how you laugh with genuine joy when your garden produces something unexpected, how you move through the world with a grace that has nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with being completely yourself without apology. He paused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering so hard she was sure he must feel it through her pulse. I've been watching you for months, he continued, fighting against feelings I told myself I had no right to have, wanting you in ways that terrified me because wanting led to expectations and expectations led to criticism, and criticism destroyed my mother inch by inch. But Eleanor, you're not my mother, and I'm not my father. We're ourselves with our own story, and maybe it's time we stopped letting their tragedy write our ending. What are you saying? Eleanor whispered, afraid to assume, afraid to hope, afraid that she was misunderstanding the subtext beneath his words, and Cole smiled then, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face into something almost beautiful. I'm saying that I want more too, he said, that I want a real marriage, want to know you in every way, want to stop maintaining this careful distance that's supposed to protect us but actually just keeps us lonely, want to face Vincent's challenge together as actual partners rather than convenient strangers, want to try for the children my mother's will requires, not because we have to, but because I can imagine no greater privilege than raising a family with you. Eleanor felt joy and terror war in her chest because this was everything she'd wanted and feared in equal measure. The promise of real intimacy with all its attendant vulnerabilities, the risk of being truly seen and possibly found wanting, the chance to build something genuine from the practical foundation they'd established. But what if we fail? She said, voicing the fear that lurked beneath her hope. What if we try for real connection and discover we're incompatible? What if opening ourselves to each other just creates new ways to hurt each other? What if your father's pattern is inescapable and love inevitably leads to cruelty? Cole cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes, and Eleanor saw in them a determination that matched her own fear. Then we'll fail honesty, he said. We'll hurt each other with truth rather than protect each other with distance. We'll choose vulnerability over safety and trust that what we've built these past months is strong enough to weather the storms that come with actual intimacy. And Eleanor, I need you to know something. I don't think you're plain. The word struck her like lightning, unexpected and illuminating, and she started to protest, to catalogue all the ways she failed to meet beauty standards. But Cole pressed a finger gently to her lips, silencing her. I think you're beautiful, he said, and his voice held such conviction that Eleanor felt something crack open inside her, beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with whether your features match some arbitrary standard and everything to do with how you move through the world, how you care for others, how you create beauty everywhere you touch, your garden, the children you teach, this house, my life. You've made everything more beautiful by being in it, and I've been a fool not to tell you so, been so terrified of becoming my father that I failed to see I was hurting you differently by withholding what you deserve to hear. Eleanor was crying openly now, years of accumulated pain and loneliness and unworthiness flowing out of her, in tears that felt like cleaning a wound, and Cole pulled her against his chest, his arms coming around her with a tenderness that suggested she was precious rather than merely useful, and she buried her face in his shirt and let herself be held for the first time since her parents died. Let herself trust that someone saw her completely and wanted her anyway. They sat like that in the garden as the sun set and the air cooled. Two people who'd married as strangers finally allowing themselves to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing between them, like plants in carefully tended soil, and Eleanor felt something inside her settle, a certainty that whatever challenges Vincent presented, whatever obstacles they faced in transforming their practical arrangement into genuine partnership, they would face them together rather than alone. Eventually Cole pulled back enough to look at her face, using his thumbs to wipe away her tears with a gentleness that made her want to cry all over again, and when he spoke his voice was steady with determination. Vincent wants to invalidate our marriage, he said, wants to claim it's not real, so he can take the ranch and squander everything my mother built. But Eleanor, we're going to prove him wrong. We're going to build the kind of marriage his small mind can't comprehend, the kind that starts with practicality and grows into something deeper, the kind my parents had before fear and cruelty corrupted it. And we're going to do it not because we have to, but because we want to, because we choose each other not just once at a chapel altar, but every day moving forward." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak around the emotion clogging her throat, and Cole leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was nothing like the chaste peck he'd given her at their wedding. This kiss was tentative but genuine, questioning and answering simultaneously, a promise and a beginning, and Eleanor kissed him back with all the longing she'd been suppressing for months, tasting salt from her tears and something sweeter that might have been hope. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cole rested his forehead against hers, and Eleanor felt the tremor running through him that matched her own, desire and fear and desperate hope all tangled together, and she knew that whatever happened next, whether they succeeded in building a real marriage or failed spectacularly trying, at least they would do it honestly, do it together, do it as partners choosing each other rather than strangers bound by convenience. "We should go back inside," Cole said eventually, his voice rough, face Vincent and Beatrice together, present a united front. Make it clear that whatever their schemes, our marriage is real and getting more real every day. But Eleanor, I want you to know that this isn't about satisfying my mother's will anymore. This isn't about keeping the ranch or defeating Vincent. This is about you and me and building something worth having regardless of external pressures. Eleanor squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his solid presence, and together they stood and walked back toward the house where light spilled from the windows and their enemies waited with poisoned tongues and legal challenges. But for the first time since her wedding day, Eleanor felt equal to whatever challenges awaited because she wasn't facing them alone anymore, wasn't trying to be enough all by herself, had a partner who saw her completely and valued what he saw, and that made all the difference between enduring and actually living. The morning after their conversation in the garden dawned clear and deceptively calm. Vincent and Beatrice departing after breakfast with promises to return soon that sounded more like threats than social pleasantries, and Eleanor felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders as she watched their carriage disappear down the long drive toward town. Cole had business in the far pastures that day, checking fence lines and water sources in preparation for moving cattle to summer grazing. And when he asked if Eleanor wanted to accompany him, she'd agreed immediately, partly because she enjoyed seeing the full scope of the ranch, and partly because after last night's emotional confessions she craved his presence, wanted to be near him even if they were simply riding in companionable silence. They set out mid-morning on horseback, Eleanor riding the gentle mare Cole had chosen for her months ago, a patient creature named Daisy, who tolerated Eleanor's still-developing riding skills with equine forbearance, and Cole on his big gelding Scout who had the intelligence and stamina required for long days working cattle. The sky was bright blue when they left the ranch buildings behind, heading toward the northern boundary where Hartford land met the open range. But Eleanor noticed clouds building on the western horizon, dark masses that suggested the possibility of afternoon rain, though neither she nor Cole mentioned them, both seemingly content to ignore potential problems in favor of enjoying the moment. The far pastures were beautiful in a way that stirred something in Eleanor's chest. Endless rolling grassland dotted with wildflowers just beginning their spring bloom, this occasional stand of live oak providing shade and windbreak, cattle grazing peacefully in groups that scattered and reformed like living clouds. And she understood viscerally why Cole's mother had fought to keep this land in the family, why the will had included such specific provisions, because Hartford Ranch wasn't just property or income, it was a legacy, a piece of Texas that had been shaped by Hartford hands for 2 generations and deserved to continue for generations more. They worked through the midday heat checking fence posts and gates, Cole pointing out things Eleanor should know about ranch management, treating her like a genuine partner whose understanding of the operation mattered rather than a decorative wife who needed protecting from practical realities, and Eleanor absorbed every detail with the same focused attention she brought to everything, asking questions that made Cole pause and consider, occasionally offering suggestions that demonstrated her quick grasp of complex systems. The storm came on faster than either of them anticipated, the clouds that had been distant smudges suddenly boiling across the sky like spilled ink, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in as many minutes, the wind picking up with a ferocity that made the horses nervous and sent small animals scurrying for shelter. "We need to get to cover," Cole said, his eyes scanning the horizon for options, and Eleanor saw his jaw tighten when he realized they were too far from the main ranch to make it back before the storm hit, too exposed on the open grassland to safely wait it out. "There's a line shack about a mile north," he continued. "Old but sound, we can shelter there until this passes," and he urged Scout into a canter that Daisy matched without needing encouragement. both horses apparently agreeing that getting out of the weather was an excellent idea. The first fat drops of rain hit when they were still half a mile from shelter, cold and hard enough to sting exposed skin, and within minutes the sky opened completely, rain coming down in sheets that reduced visibility to almost nothing, soaking through Eleanor's riding clothes and plastering her hair to her skull despite the hat she'd worn. Lightning cracked across the sky close enough that Eleanor felt the hair on her arms stand up, the thunder following so quickly it was almost simultaneous, and Daisy shied sideways, nearly unseating Eleanor before the mare steadied and pressed on through the deluge. The line shack materialized out of the rain like a mirage. A small rough structure built of native stone and weathered timber, and Cole dismounted in one fluid motion, reaching up to help Eleanor down before leading both horses to the lean-to shelter attached to the shack's side where they'd be protected from the worst of the weather. Eleanor stood shivering in the downpour while Cole secured the horses, her teeth chattering despite the fact that it was spring and shouldn't be this cold. But Texas weather followed no predictable rules, and the temperature had dropped enough that her wet clothes felt like ice against her skin. Inside, Cole commanded, and Eleanor stumbled through the door into a dim interior that smelled of dust and disuse, but was blessedly dry, the roof holding. Despite obvious age, the single room furnished with basic necessities, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a small stove, a table and 2 chairs, shelves holding supplies left for emergencies exactly like this one. Cole followed her in, water streaming from his hat and clothes, and he immediately moved to the stove, checking that the flue was clear before starting a fire with practiced efficiency, coaxing flame from kindling and then adding larger pieces of wood until heat began to radiate into the cold space. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said without looking at her, his voice gruff with concern. "There should be blankets in that chest. They'll be musty but dry, and you'll catch your death if you stay in wet things." Eleanor's hands shook too badly to manage the buttons on her riding jacket, her fingers numb and clumsy, and after watching her struggle for a moment, Cole crossed to her and gently pushed her hands aside, unfastening the buttons himself with the same capable efficiency he brought to every task. His touch was impersonal, focused on the practical need to get her warm, but Eleanor felt acutely aware of his proximity, the heat radiating from his body, the intent focus on his face as he worked, and when he slipped the jacket from her shoulders, his hands lingered for just a moment before he turned away to drape the sodden garment over a chair near the stove. Eleanor managed her shirt buttons herself, though it took longer than it should have, her coordination compromised by cold and the strange awareness thrumming through her body, and she wrapped herself in a blanket from the chest. The fabric indeed musty but blessedly dry and warm, while Cole stripped off his own wet outer layers with his back turned, offering her privacy even though they were married, even though last night they'd agreed to pursue real intimacy, old habits of distance apparently hard to break. The storm intensified outside, wind howling around the shack's corners, rain hammering against the roof and walls with percussive fury, lightning illuminating the single window in strobing flashes followed by thunder that shook the building's foundation, and Eleanor found herself grateful for the solid stone walls, the tight construction that kept them dry even as nature raged beyond their shelter. They stood awkwardly for a moment, both wrapped in blankets, the space between them feeling vast despite the shack's small size, and Eleanor realized that this was the first time they'd truly been alone together since their wedding night. The first time circumstances had forced them into genuine proximity without the buffer of ranch business or household staff or the careful routines they'd establish to maintain appropriate distance. "We should talk," Cole said finally, moving to sit on one of the chairs, and Eleanor took the other, the fire crackling between them casting shifting shadows on the stone walls, and she waited for him to continue, watching firelight play across his features and thinking that he was handsome in a weathered, solid way she'd never allowed herself to notice before last night's confessions. "I need to explain something I said last night," he began, his grey eyes fixed on the flames rather than on her face. "About choosing you because of your plainness, because I realized after you went to bed that I'd said it wrong, made it sound like your appearance was the only thing I considered, when the truth is more complicated and possibly worse, depending on how you interpret it." Eleanor felt her chest tighten with familiar hurt, the old wound of inadequacy opening fresh, and she pulled the blanket tighter around herself as if it could protect her from whatever Cole was about to say. "Just tell me," she said quietly. "Whatever it is, just be honest, I'd rather know the truth than wonder." Cole took a deep breath, his hands clasped between his knees, and when he spoke his voice was low and pained, each word clearly costing him something. "I chose you because I thought your plainness would make you safe to marry," he said, and Eleanor flinched at the brutal honesty even though she'd asked for it. "I thought that if I married someone who didn't meet conventional beauty standards, then I wouldn't be tempted to care about your appearance, wouldn't notice when you aged or changed, wouldn't become my father who slowly destroyed my mother with 1,000 small cruelties about her looks, and I genuinely believed that was protective, that choosing safety over attraction was the kindest thing I could do for both of us." The words landed like blows, each one reinforcing what Eleanor had always suspected, that she'd been selected not despite her plainness but because of it, that her very ordinariness had been the qualification that mattered most, and she felt anger rise hot and sharp beneath the hurt, burning away the vulnerability of last night's confessions and replacing it with something fiercer. "So you married me because you couldn't love me," she said, her voice shaking with emotion she didn't try to hide, "because my plainness would protect you from developing feelings that might lead to cruelty. That's worse than marrying for beauty, Cole. That's marrying specifically to avoid any possibility of genuine affection. That's choosing me because I was safe to ignore, to overlook, to never really see." Her voice had risen, years of accumulated pain finally finding outlet, and she stood abruptly, the blanket falling from her shoulders, leaving her in just her chemise and petticoat. But she was too angry to care about modesty, too furious to worry about propriety. "You stood in that chapel and said I was enough," she continued, pacing the small space like a caged animal, "but what you meant was that I was sufficiently unremarkable to not threaten you, sufficiently plain to be safely dismissed, and I was fool enough to believe that maybe enough could become something more, that maybe a man who valued competence might eventually value the woman behind the competence. But you never intended that, did you? You intended for us to live separate lives under the same roof forever, convenient strangers who never risked actual connection, because connection requires caring, and caring was exactly what you wanted to avoid." Cole stood too, his face stricken, and he reached for her, but Eleanor stepped back, her anger a shield against the hurt threatening to drown her, and she saw something break in his expression, saw his careful control crumble, saw beneath it an anguish that matched her own. "You're right," he said, his voice raw. "You're absolutely right. I chose you thinking I could keep you at safe distance, thinking I could have a wife without the vulnerability of actually caring what happened to her, thinking I could avoid my father's mistakes by never allowing myself to feel anything that might curdle into cruelty. And God help me, Eleanor. It might have worked if you'd been the person I imagined when I proposed, some competent but unremarkable woman who would manage my household and leave me alone. But you're not that person. You've never been that person, and my careful plan to remain safely indifferent lasted maybe a month before it started falling apart." Eleanor stared at him, her anger faltering in the face of his obvious pain, and Cole continued, the words pouring out like he'd been holding them back too long and couldn't contain them anymore. "I started noticing things about you I had no business noticing," he said. "The way you bite your lip when you're concentrating on difficult tasks, how you laugh with the children you teach like their joy is your joy, the fierce determination on your face when you're negotiating for better prices or defending someone who needs help, the gentleness in your hands when you're tending your garden or mending clothes or nursing the sick. And I tried to tell myself it was just appreciation for your competence, just gratitude for how you'd improved the ranch. But Eleanor, I was lying to myself because what I felt had nothing to do with practical appreciation and everything to do with wanting you in ways that terrified me." He moved closer, and this time Eleanor didn't retreat, frozen by the intensity in his voice, the emotion she'd never heard from him before. And when he spoke again, his words came out barely above a whisper. "I've been falling in love with you," he said, and the confession hung in the air between them like lightning, bright and dangerous. "I've been falling in love with your strength and kindness and competence, yes, but also with things that have nothing to do with utility, with the sound of your voice when you read to the children, with the way you move, through the world like you're determined to make it better through sheer force of will, with your freckles that darken in the sun and your copper hair that won't hold a curl and your thin hands that create beauty everywhere they touch. And I don't know how to tell you these things without sounding like I'm lying, without sounding like my father who claimed to love my mother while slowly killing her with criticism disguised as concern." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, her anger transforming into something more complex. Hurt and hope tangled so tightly she couldn't separate them, and she found her voice, though it shook with emotion. Your father was cruel precisely because he did care about beauty, she said, the words coming from understanding she'd gained reading Catherine's journals. He cared desperately about how your mother looked because he'd internalized society's standards and couldn't reconcile loving someone who didn't meet them. So he tried to change her, tried to make her into something she wasn't. But Cole, you're not doing that. You're not asking me to change. You're not suggesting I could improve myself. You're, what? Loving me as I am, which according to you means loving someone plain and unremarkable. How is that different from your father's cruelty, except that you're honest about finding me unattractive? She heard the bitterness in her own voice. The old wound still bleeding despite everything, and Cole made a sound of frustration, running his hands through his damp hair, and when he looked at her, his eyes blazed, with something fierce enough to steal her breath. I don't find you unattractive, he said, his voice rising to match hers. I find you beautiful, Eleanor, have found you beautiful for months now, and it's been driving me slowly insane because I'm terrified that saying so makes me like my father, makes me someone who values appearance. But the truth is I can't stop noticing you, can't stop seeing how the lamplight catches in your hair when you're reading in the evenings, can't stop watching your hands move when you're working, because there's grace in how you touch things, how you create and mend and heal. Can't stop wanting to touch you myself, to know if your skin is as soft as it looks, to find out what sounds you'd make if I kissed you properly instead of that pathetic peck I gave you at our wedding. Eleanor's breath caught, her anger evaporating in the heat of his confession, replaced by yearning so intense it was almost painful, and she stepped closer to him, close enough to see the rapid pulse in his throat, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. You think I'm beautiful, she repeated, testing the words, trying to believe them, and Cole reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands the way he had in the garden last night, his calloused palms rough against her cheeks. I think you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, he said, and his voice held such conviction that Eleanor felt something shift inside her, some fundamental belief about her own worthlessness cracking under the weight of his certainty. I think your freckles are like constellations I could map forever. I think your eyes hold more depth than any painted beauties ever could. I think your mouth was made for smiling and kissing and saying the hard truths people need to hear. I think your body is perfect exactly as it is, strong and capable and more appealing than any corseted, fashionable figure. And I think I'm the luckiest man in Texas that you agreed to marry me even when I was too much of a coward to tell you any of this. Eleanor couldn't speak around the emotion clogging her throat, couldn't process the enormity of what he was saying, that Cole Hartford thought she was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, not beautiful despite her plainness, or beautiful in some abstract metaphorical way, but actually physically beautiful, and the thought was so foreign, so incompatible with everything she'd believed about herself for 26 years, that she couldn't absorb it, couldn't let it be true without shattering every defense she'd built against the pain of being overlooked. You're not your father, she whispered finally, and you never could be, because your father tried to change what he saw while you're telling me I don't need changing. Your father's cruelty came from rejection while you're offering acceptance. And Cole, I've been so afraid of wanting more than our arrangement allowed. So afraid of hoping you might see me as something other than useful. So afraid that if I let myself love you, I'd be destroyed when you couldn't love me back. But maybe I've been as wrong about what's possible between us as you were about what you could feel. Cole's thumb stroked her cheekbones, wiping away tears she hadn't realized were falling, and his grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel seen in ways she'd never experienced, like he was looking past all her defences directly into her guarded heart, and finding there something precious, rather than the inadequacy she'd always assumed defined her. Tell me what you want, Eleanor, he said softly. Tell me what you need from me, because I'll give you anything. Distance, if that's what protects you. Patience while you decide if you can trust what I'm saying. Time to adjust to this shift between us. Or, and his voice dropped even lower, grew rougher, with barely contained desire, or I'll give you everything. Give you the marriage we both pretended we didn't want. Give you intimacy and partnership and love if you'll let me. If you can believe that I mean what I'm saying, that when I look at you I see beauty and strength and everything I could possibly want in a wife and partner and lover. The word lover sent heat through Eleanor's body, igniting something she'd suppressed her entire life, and she realized that she was standing in her undergarments inches from her husband while a storm raged outside, and the whole world had narrowed to this moment, this choice, this opportunity to claim what she wanted, instead of settling for what she thought she deserved. "I want everything," she heard herself say, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want you to kiss me like you mean it. Want you to show me what it feels like to be desired instead of merely needed. Want you to prove that this isn't some elaborate kindness or obligation, but genuine want. And Cole, I want to consummate our marriage not because Vincent's challenge requires it, but because I choose it. Choose you, choose us, and whatever we might become if we're brave enough to try." Cole's answering smile was like sunrise, transforming his serious face into something radiant, and he leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind, to retreat behind safe boundaries. But Eleanor rose on her toes to meet him halfway, and when their lips touched, it was nothing like that chaste wedding kiss. This kiss was hungry and searching, Cole's mouth moving against hers with barely restrained passion, while his hand slid into her damp hair, tilting her head to deepen the contact. Eleanor had never been kissed before, had no experience to guide her, but instinct took over and she opened to him, her hands fisting in his shirt to pull him closer, and she felt him groan against her mouth, the sound vibrating through her entire body and settling low in her belly as heat and need. They broke apart gasping, both trembling, and Cole rested his forehead against hers while they caught their breath. And Eleanor could feel his heart hammering against her palms where they pressed to his chest. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to careful distance, no pretending we're just convenient partners, and I need to know you want this for the right reasons. Not because Vincent's challenge forces your hand or because you think it's your duty, but because you genuinely want me the way I want you." Eleanor pulled back enough to look into his eyes, needing him to see her certainty. And when she spoke, her voice was clear and firm despite her nervousness. "I want you," she said simply. "Want this. Want us. And not because of Vincent or duty or any external pressure, but because these past months have taught me that marriages can grow beyond their origins, that convenience can transform into something deeper if both people choose it. And I'm choosing it. Choosing you. Choosing to believe that maybe I am beautiful enough, worthy enough in every way to deserve love and desire and partnership." Cole's eyes blazed with emotion too complex to name, and he kissed her again, softer this time but no less intense, his hands gentle as they traced down her arms, her sides, learning the shape of her through the thin fabric of her chemise. And Eleanor shivered at his touch, her body responding with an intensity that surprised and slightly frightened her. He lifted her, easily carrying her the few steps to the narrow cot, laying her down with a tenderness that made tears prick her eyes again, and he followed her down, his weight pressing her into the thin mattress, his warmth surrounding her, and Eleanor felt safe and desired in equal measure, felt like this was exactly where she belonged. What followed was tentative and awkward and beautiful, two people learning each other's bodies and responses, Cole taking his time despite obvious desire, checking her comfort, asking questions, responding to her gasps and sighs with infinite patience, and Eleanor discovered that her body was capable of pleasure she'd never imagined. That intimacy could be tender and passionate simultaneously, that being seen completely, physically and emotionally didn't destroy her, but instead made her feel more real, more present, more alive than she'd ever been. Cole whispered against her skin, words she only half heard through the roaring in her blood. Beautiful, so beautiful, and mine, finally mine. And Eleanor arched into his touch, into his words, believing them in this moment, if not quite forever, choosing to accept that perhaps she was beautiful to him, even if the rest of the world would never see it. The storm outside continued its fury, lightning and thunder providing counterpoint to their joining, and when Eleanor finally cried out Cole's name, her body shattering into pleasure she'd never known existed, he followed her over that edge, bearing his face against her neck and breathing her name like a prayer or a benediction. Afterward, they lay tangled together on the narrow cot, the blanket pulled over them both, their breathing gradually slowing, and Eleanor felt changed in ways she couldn't fully articulate, like some fundamental truth about herself had shifted, like she'd been rewritten at the cellular level. Cole stroked her hair, his touch gentle, and Eleanor felt him press a kiss to her temple, her cheek, the corner of her mouth, and each touch felt like a promise, like he was learning her through repetition, memorizing her like she was something precious. "I love you," he said quietly, and the words felt both monumental and natural, like they'd been waiting to be spoken for months. "I love your strength and kindness and competence, yes, but I also love things that have nothing to do with utility. Love how you make me laugh when I thought I'd forgotten how. Love your terrible singing voice when you think no one's listening. Love the way you care about people who can't do anything for you in return. Love your stubbornness and your unexpected gentleness and your habit of stealing the blankets in your sleep, though I only just discovered that last one." Eleanor laughed despite the tears streaming down her face, and she pressed her palm to his cheek, feeling the rasp of his beard, the solid warmth of him, the reality of this man who'd chosen her and kept choosing her. "I love you too," she whispered, and the admission felt like jumping. Off a cliff, terrifying and exhilarating. "I think I've been loving you for months without admitting it. Loving how you treat the ranch hands with respect, how you built me a bench in my garden without my asking, how you listen when I talk about things that interest me, even when they're not your areas of expertise, how you're trying so hard not to be your father that you've become someone better, someone kinder, someone who sees people's value beyond their surface appearances." They stayed there as the storm gradually spent itself, the rain easing from deluge to steady downpour to occasional drops, the thunder moving east, the lightning becoming distant flashes, and neither of them suggested getting up, getting dressed, returning to the practical world that waited beyond their shelter. This moment felt suspended somehow, separate from the challenges they'd face when they rode back to the ranch. Vincent's threat, the 2-year timeline, the gossip and speculation that would intensify if anyone learned they'd been alone together in the line shack. And Eleanor wanted to hold on to it as long as possible, wanted to memorize how it felt to be held and loved and desired. Eventually, though, practicality reasserted itself. Their clothes had dried near the fire, and they needed to return before Mrs. Chen worried, before the ranch hands went searching, before their absence created more complications in lives already complicated enough. They dressed slowly, stealing touches and kisses, and Eleanor felt different in her sin, more comfortable in her body than she'd ever been, like Cole's desire had given her permission to inhabit herself fully, rather than apologizing for her physical existence. The ride back to the ranch was quiet but companionable, both of them processing what had happened, what it meant, how it changed their path forward, and when they finally came within sight of the ranch buildings, Eleanor felt equal parts relief and regret. Relief to be home safe and regret that their private interlude had ended, that they'd have to share each other with the world again. Mrs. Chen met them at the door with obvious relief, fussing about them being caught in the storm, insisting they needed hot food and dry clothes, and Eleanor caught the housekeeper's knowing look when Cole's hand lingered at the small of Eleanor's back, when their eyes met across the dinner table with new intimacy, when they bid each other good night at the top of the stairs and then both hesitated, as if unsure whether separate bedrooms still applied to their transformed relationship. Eleanor started toward her room, old habit guiding her feet, but Cole caught her hand, his grey eyes questioning, and she understood that he was asking without words if she wanted privacy or partnership, distance or closeness, and she made her choice by following him into his room, into the bed covered with the wedding ring quilt she'd mended with such care. And as Cole pulled her close and she settled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Eleanor thought about Catherine's journals, about marriages that started cold and grew warm, about the possibility that she and Cole were writing their own version of that story, one where plainness transformed into beauty not through physical change, but through being seen completely by someone who valued what he saw. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor Brennan Hartford felt beautiful, felt worthy, felt like perhaps enough had finally become everything she'd ever needed. When Cole and Eleanor rode back to the ranch that evening, still glowing with the intimacy they'd discovered in the line shack, they found the yard filled with wagons and horses, the entire household in upheaval, and Mrs. Chen rushing out to meet them with news that drained the colour from Eleanor's face, and set Cole's jaw in that tight line she'd learned meant he was controlling fury. "Vincent has called a town meeting," Mrs. Chen said without preamble, her usual composure frayed. "At the chapel, right? Now, he's been spreading word all afternoon that he has evidence your marriage is a sham, and he's demanding the town bear witness when he presents his case to Judge Morrison. He says the ranch should be turned over to him immediately, and he wants the community to see justice done." Eleanor felt the warmth of the afternoon drain away, replaced by cold dread, because of course Vincent wouldn't accept defeat gracefully, wouldn't simply retreat when his initial challenge failed to break them, would instead escalate to public spectacle because shame was a weapon he wielded expertly, and he'd correctly identified that Eleanor's greatest vulnerability was her fear of being found inadequate in front of witnesses. "We should go," Cole said, his voice steady despite the fury Eleanor could see in his eyes. "We should face this together, Let Vincent make his case and then destroy it with truth. And Eleanor, I need you to trust me. Trust that I can handle this, that we can handle this, that what happened this afternoon gives us strength rather than vulnerability." Eleanor nodded, though her stomach churned with anxiety, and they quickly changed into fresh clothes, Eleanor choosing the blue dress Cole had once said brought out the colour of her eyes. Cole in his Sunday suit that made him look every inch the prosperous rancher he was, and together they rode toward a town, toward the chapel where they'd married 4 months ago, toward whatever confrontation Vincent had orchestrated. The chapel was packed when they arrived, every pew filled, and people standing along the walls, the same townspeople who'd witnessed their wedding, now gathered to potentially witness its destruction. And Eleanor felt every eye turn toward them as they entered, saw expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity to barely concealed schadenfreude. Saw Beatrice Sutton sitting in the front pew beside Vincent looking smug and beautiful and certain of victory. Vincent stood at the front of the chapel near the altar, a position that struck Eleanor as deliberately blasphemous, and Judge Morrison sat in the first pew with obvious reluctance, his expression suggesting he found this entire proceeding distasteful, but felt obligated to hear Vincent's case given his legal standing as Catherine Hartford's nephew and potential heir. "Ladies and gentlemen of Redemption Creek," Vincent began, his voice carrying that practiced charm that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Thank you for gathering on such short notice. I've called you here because a matter of justice and family honour requires public witness. My cousin Cole has attempted to circumvent our aunt's will through a marriage of convenience that violates both the letter and spirit of her intention, and I believe the community deserves to know the truth before Hartford Ranch, a pillar of this county's prosperity, is inherited by someone who achieved it through deception." Eleanor felt Cole's hand find hers, his grip steady and warm, anchoring her against the rising tide of public attention, and she forced herself to breathe, to remember that she'd done nothing wrong, that their marriage was real even if it had started as convenience, that Vincent's poison couldn't unmake what she and Cole had built unless they let it. Vincent continued pacing like a lawyer presenting a case, and Eleanor recognized that he'd rehearsed this, had planned every word for maximum impact. "The evidence is quite clear," he said, pulling papers from his jacket pocket. "I have testimony from staff at the Hartford Ranch that Cole and Eleanor maintain separate bedrooms, that they show no physical affection, that their relationship is indistinguishable from that of employer and employee. I have statements from townspeople who witnessed the wedding and noted the complete lack of romantic feeling between the parties. And I have my own observations from staying at the ranch that this marriage is a legal fiction designed solely to satisfy the technical requirements of my aunt's will while violating its clear intent that the ranch pass to someone committed to building a family there." He paused for effect, his eyes scanning the crowd, and Eleanor saw several people nodding, saw Mrs. Patterson whispering to her husband, saw Beatrice's smile widening. "Furthermore," Vincent continued, "the will specifically requires not just marriage, but a true union blessed by family continuation within 2 years, language my lawyer interprets as requiring consummation and conception. And given that Cole and Eleanor have been married 4 months without any indication of intimacy or pregnancy, I submit that this requirement cannot and will not be met, making the entire arrangement invalid and the ranch rightfully mine as the next Hartford heir." The chapel erupted in whispers, people turning to their neighbours to share opinions and speculation. And Eleanor felt heat flood her face as her most private arrangements were dissected for public consumption, felt the familiar shame of being found inadequate, of failing to meet expectations, of being too plain even to inspire her husband's desire. Judge Morrison cleared his throat, restoring a semblance of order, and turned to Cole with an expression that mixed legal obligation with personal sympathy. "Cole, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" the judge asked. "Or should we retire to chambers to discuss this matter more privately?" Eleanor felt Cole's grip tighten on her hand, felt him take a breath, and when he spoke his voice carried clearly through the chapel, steady and certain. "I'll respond here," Cole said, standing and drawing Eleanor up with him, "because Vincent chose to make this public, and I won't hide truth behind closed doors. These people are my neighbours and friends, and they deserve honesty, deserve to understand what's really at stake here, which isn't legal technicalities or inheritance disputes, but something more fundamental about what we value as a community, about what kind of worth we recognise in each other." He paused, and Eleanor saw him look around the chapel, making eye contact with individuals, acknowledging their presence, and she felt something shift in the atmosphere. Curiosity replacing judgment, attention sharpening. 4 months ago in this very chapel, Cole continued, my wife Eleanor stood before you and declared herself too plain to be my bride, spoke aloud the fear that had haunted her entire life, that her worth depended on beauty she didn't possess, and I responded with 3 words that I believed at the time were sufficient. I said she was enough. The chapel was silent now, everyone leaning forward, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes because she knew what was coming, knew Cole was about to expose everything, and she braced herself for humiliation or vindication, couldn't predict which. I was wrong, Cole said, and the chapel gasped collectively, exactly as Eleanor had feared, heads turning, whispers starting, Beatrice's smile becoming triumphant. But Cole raised his hand for silence, and incredibly the crowd obeyed, settling back to listen. She's not enough, Cole continued, his voice growing stronger. She's everything. And there's a profound difference between those 2 words that I need this community to understand, because you've all been complicit in making Eleanor believe the lie that plain women have lesser value, that beauty is the currency by which we measure female worth, and I'm here to tell you that you're wrong, that every single person who pitied Eleanor or dismissed her or failed to see what was directly in front of you was blind in ways that matter far more than any physical appearance. He turned to look at Eleanor directly, his grey eyes blazing with emotion, and she felt pinned by his gaze, unable to look away, barely able to breathe. Let me tell you about my wife, Cole said, still looking at Eleanor but speaking to the crowd. Let me catalogue exactly what you've all failed to notice while you were too busy dismissing her as plain. Eleanor Hartford came to my ranch 4 months ago with nothing but a carpet bag and a lifetime of being overlooked. And in that time she's transformed not just my household, but this entire community in ways most of you haven't bothered to acknowledge. He finally turned back to address the chapel, his hand still gripping Eleanor's, and he began listing her accomplishments with the same precision he used for ranch accounts. She reorganized the household to run more efficiently, saving the ranch $300 in the first quarter alone, he said. She established a school for ranch children that now serves 12 students who previously had no access to education, teaching them reading and arithmetic and giving them opportunities their parents never had. She created a garden that produces more vegetables than we can use, the surplus feeding ranch families and reducing our food costs by 40%. She started a chicken breeding program that's generating $60 monthly in pure profit from egg sales. She nursed Maria Santos through a fever that would have killed her and has since provided medical care to half the families in this room, treating ailments and injuries with skill that saved us all doctors' fees and possibly saved lives. The chapel was silent, people exchanging glances, and Eleanor saw several women nodding, recognizing their own interactions with her, their own debts to her competence. But those are just the practical contributions, Cole continued, and his voice softened slightly. Let me tell you about the other things Eleanor has done, the things that don't show up in account books but matter just as much. She's given hope to children who thought education wasn't for people like them. She's shown kindness to people society dismisses. She's created beauty in her garden and in every space she touches. She works from dawn until late evening, not because she has to, but because she cares, genuinely cares, about making things better, about helping people, about building rather than taking. He paused, gathering himself, and when he continued, his voice was thick with emotion. And now Vincent stands here and calls this marriage a sham, questions its validity because we maintained separate bedrooms for the first months, suggests that lack of immediate intimacy proves lack of genuine connection. But I ask you, is that really the measure of a true marriage, whether 2 people share a bed from day one, or is a true marriage built on something deeper? On respect that grows into affection, on partnership that transforms into love, on choosing each other not just once at an altar, but every day through actions that demonstrate commitment. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face now, unable to contain the emotion flooding through her, and she saw that she wasn't alone. Several women in the congregation were crying openly. Mrs. Patterson dabbing at her eyes, even Judge Morrison's wife looking moved. Vincent wants you to believe Eleanor is inadequate, Cole said, his voice hardening. Wants you to focus on her appearance and ignore her character. Wants you to measure her worth by beauty standards she'll never meet instead of by the actual value she creates. And I'm telling you that every person who accepts that framework, who agrees that plain women matter less than beautiful ones, who dismisses Eleanor's contributions because she doesn't look like Beatrice Sutton, is complicit in a cruelty that destroys good people for no reason beyond satisfying shallow prejudice. He turned back to Eleanor, and she saw love blazing in his eyes, unconcealed and undeniable. "You want to know about her plainness," Cole said, still addressing the crowd but looking at Eleanor. "Let me tell you about every supposedly plain feature. Her freckles that Vincent mocked, every single one earned under the Texas sun while she worked to feed others, to grow food, to create abundance. Those aren't flaws, they're badges of honor, proof of labor and care. Her thin frame that doesn't match fashionable curves, built by years of making sure others ate before she did, of putting community needs ahead of personal comfort, her work-roughened hands that lack the softness of ladies who've never done manual labor, hands that have created and mended and healed, that build beauty everywhere they touch, her copper hair that won't hold a curl and doesn't gleam like golden silk, practical and honest, refusing to be something it's not, exactly like the woman herself." The chapel was absolutely silent now, every person riveted, and Eleanor felt something fundamental shifting, saw it in people's faces, understanding dawning, old assumptions being questioned. "This is not plainness," Cole said, his voice rising with conviction. "This is beauty that lasts, beauty that matters, beauty that builds rather than destroys, beauty that makes the world better, rather than just prettier. And if you can't see it, then the blindness is yours, not hers. And you're missing something precious while you chase after shallow appearances that fade with the time and mean nothing when life gets difficult." He paused, breathing hard, and Eleanor saw that his own eyes were wet, saw that this speech was costing him something, exposing vulnerabilities he usually kept hidden. "I love my wife," Cole said simply. "Love everything Vincent calls plain. Love her freckles and her thin frame and her rough hands and her practical hair. Love them because they're evidence of who she is, of the life she's lived, of the character she's built through years of being dismissed and overlooked, and told she wasn't good enough, and the fact that she survived all that and remained kind and remained generous, remained willing to care about others. That's not plainness. That's extraordinary strength that should be celebrated, not diminished." Eleanor couldn't stay silent any longer, couldn't let Cole fight this battle alone, and she stepped forward, her voice shaking but clear. "I believed I was too plain," she said, addressing the townspeople directly. "Believed it so deeply that I let it define my entire life. Let it convince me I deserved less, expected less, should settle for whatever scraps of regard people might offer. And when Cole proposed, I accepted, because I thought a marriage of convenience was the best someone like me could hope for, thought that being useful was sufficient compensation for never being wanted." She saw recognition in several women's faces, saw them nodding because they understood, had felt the same pressures, carried the same wounds. "But these past months have taught me something," Eleanor continued, her confidence growing. "Taught me that beauty is a story we tell ourselves about worth, and we've been telling the wrong story, measuring women by standards designed to keep us insecure and grateful for male attention, rather than recognizing our inherent value. And I'm done accepting that story, done believing that my freckles and thin frame and rough hands make me less than women who meet arbitrary appearance standards, done apologizing for taking up space in the world." She turned to look at Vincent directly, her fear transforming into anger. "You want to take this ranch because you think you deserve it more than me," she said. "You think your Hartford name and male gender and conventional handsomeness entitle you to inheritance, regardless of character or capability. But let me tell you what I've learned about deserve. People deserve what they build, what they create, what they contribute. And I've built more on this ranch in 4 months than you've built in your entire dissolute life. So, no, Vincent, you don't deserve Hartford Ranch. You never did. And your aunt knew it, which is why she put conditions in her will. Conditions I've met and you never could." The chapel erupted, people talking over each other, and Judge Morrison stood, raising his hands for order, his expression suggesting he'd heard enough. Before anyone could speak further, Mrs. Chen stood from where she'd been sitting quietly in the back, and the housekeeper's presence commanded attention, respect earned through decades of service. "I have something to present," Mrs. Chen said, moving forward with a ledger Eleanor recognized as the household accounts, evidence that might illuminate this discussion. "With Mrs. Hartford's permission, I'd like to show Judge Morrison exactly what she's accomplished these past months, the financial impact of her management, because numbers don't lie the way people do." Eleanor nodded, grateful, and watched as Mrs. Chen presented the ledger to Judge Morrison, pointing out entries, explaining systems, demonstrating with cold numerical fact what Cole had described in emotional terms, and she saw the judge's eyebrows rise, saw him making notes, saw his expression shift from skeptical to impressed. Then Tom Patterson stood, the usually quiet man clearing his throat nervously. "I'd like to say something if permitted," he said. "My wife's been poorly this year, lung trouble, and we couldn't afford the doctor. Thought we'd just have to pray she pulled through. But Eleanor, Mrs. Hartford, she came when she heard, brought medicines and sat up 3 nights running until the fever broke, didn't ask for payment, didn't make my wife feel like charity, just helped because that's who she is. And I'm standing here to say that woman saved my wife's life and probably our farm, because if Martha had died, I couldn't have managed alone." More people stood then, ranch hands and their wives, townspeople who'd benefited from Eleanor's school or medical care or simple kindness, and each one added their testimony to the growing pile of evidence that Eleanor Hartford was not just adequate but extraordinary, that her contributions had touched nearly every family present, that dismissing her as plain missed everything important about who she was and what she meant to the community. Carlos Santos spoke haltingly about Maria's illness, his voice breaking when he described thinking he'd lose his wife, thanking Eleanor for her skill and compassion. The Morrison daughter talked about how Eleanor had helped her negotiate better terms with a difficult supplier, saving her family business money. One of the ranch children Eleanor taught stood on a pew and read a passage from a book, demonstrating learning that wouldn't exist without Eleanor's school. Finally, Judge Morrison raised his hand, silencing the testimonials, and turned to Vincent with an expression of barely concealed disgust. "I've heard enough," the judge said, his voice carrying judicial authority. "Vincent Hartford, your interpretation of Catherine Hartford's will is wishful thinking at best and deliberate deception at worst. The language requiring a true union blessed by family continuation is clearly metaphorical, referring to building a lasting marriage that honors family values, not a clinical checklist of consummation and conception timelines. And even if it weren't, the evidence presented here today demonstrates conclusively that Cole and Eleanor have built exactly the kind of marriage Catherine intended, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose that benefits not just themselves but the entire community." Vincent's face flushed with anger, his handsome features twisting into something ugly. "You can't just ignore the separate bedrooms," he protested. "Ignore the obvious lack of genuine affection. Ignore that this entire marriage was contracted for convenience rather than love." "Actually, I can," Judge Morrison said calmly, "because marriage law in Texas doesn't require couples to share bedrooms or demonstrate affection to strangers or prove their emotions meet some arbitrary standard of genuineness. Marriage law requires consent, legal capacity, and public declaration, all of which clearly exist here. And furthermore," he continued, looking around the chapel, "I'm troubled by this. Proceeding, troubled that we've gathered to publicly dissect a private relationship, troubled that we've allowed a bitter, disappointed heir to weaponize a good woman's insecurities, troubled that we nearly let Vincent Hartford convince us to value appearance over substance, and I'm ruling here and now that the marriage is valid, the will is satisfied, and Vincent has no claim to Hartford Ranch now or in the future." The chapel erupted in applause, people standing and clapping, and Eleanor felt her knees weaken with relief, felt Cole's arm come around her waist to steady her, felt the weight of months of anxiety lift from her shoulders. Beatrice stood abruptly, her beautiful face contorted with fury, and she turned on Vincent with venom. "You told me this would work," she hissed, loud enough for nearby people to hear. "Told me you'd get the ranch and we'd live there in luxury. Told me that plain little nobody couldn't possibly have built a real marriage with Cole. But you were wrong, and I'm not staying with a penniless wastrel who can't even successfully challenge a seamstress for what should be his inheritance." She swept from the chapel, her silk skirts rustling, leaving Vincent standing alone and exposed, and Eleanor almost pitied him, almost felt sympathy for how thoroughly his schemes had collapsed. But then she remembered his cruelty, his calculated attacks on her vulnerabilities, and the pity evaporated. Vincent left without another word, his shoulders hunched in defeat, and the crowd parted to let him pass, their expressions ranging from satisfaction to second-hand embarrassment. And Eleanor knew that Redemption Creek would be talking about this day for years, that the story of how Cole Hartford defended his plain wife would become legend. People surged forward then, wanting to congratulate them, to apologize for doubts, to express support, and Eleanor found herself embraced by women who'd previously pitied her, women who whispered thank you in her ear, women who said variations of "you made me feel less alone in my plainness, made me think maybe I have value too." Mrs. Patterson hugged her fiercely, tears streaming down the older woman's face. "You have no idea what you did here today," she whispered. No idea how many of us have spent our lives believing we weren't good enough, pretty enough, worthy enough. And hearing Cole defend you like that, hearing him redefine beauty to include things we actually possess rather than things we'll never have. She couldn't finish, just hugged Eleanor tighter, said, and Eleanor hugged her back, understanding finally that her story had never been just hers, that her wounds were collective wounds, that her healing might help others heal too. Judge Morrison approached Cole with an expression of respect. "That was quite a speech," the judge said, "quite a defense of your wife, and I think you've done more than save your ranch today. You've given this community something to think about, challenged assumptions we've all been making without examination, and I, for one, am grateful." Cole nodded his thanks, but his attention was on Eleanor, his eyes never leaving her face for long, and when the crowd finally thinned and they found themselves relatively alone in the chapel where they'd married, he pulled her close and kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth with tender reverence. "I meant every word," he said quietly. "Every single word. You are everything, Eleanor. Everything I could want or need. And if I never tell you that often enough, if I fall back into taking you for granted, I give you permission to remind me of this moment, to make me catalogue all over again every specific thing I love about you." Eleanor laughed through her tears, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "You turned the whole town speechless," she said. "Literally made them stop talking and listen, made them see me differently, made me see myself differently. And Cole, I don't think I can ever thank you enough for that, for fighting for me, for defending me, for loving me loudly enough that everyone could hear." "We fought for each other," Cole corrected. "You stood up there too, claimed your worth, refused to accept Vincent's narrative, and that took courage." "I'm not sure I would have had if our positions were reversed. And Eleanor, this is what our marriage is going to be. Both of us fighting for each other, defending each other, seeing each other clearly enough to recognize value that others miss." They stood there in the empty chapel as the afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass window, casting coloured shadows across the worn wooden floor. And Eleanor thought about how this space had witnessed both her greatest fear and her greatest triumph, how she'd stood here 4 months ago believing she was too plain to deserve love, and stood here today, understanding that plainness was never the problem, that she'd been measuring herself by the wrong standards her entire life. Outside they could hear the sounds of Redemption Creek returning to normal, wagons departing, people calling farewells, life continuing after the drama had concluded. And Eleanor felt a deep sense of peace settle over her, the knowledge that she was seen and valued and loved not despite her ordinariness but because the right person had finally recognized that ordinary was just another word for real, for authentic, for worthy of celebration rather than dismissal. They walked out of the chapel hand in hand into the late afternoon light, toward the wagon that would take them home to Hartford Ranch, to the life they were building together, to the future that had seemed impossible 4 months ago but now stretched before them full of possibility, and Eleanor knew that whatever challenges they faced moving forward, they would face them together. Two plain people who'd discovered that love didn't require beauty, only the courage to see each other truly, and the wisdom to value what they found. 6 months later, Eleanor. Hartford knelt in her garden, in the warm September sunshine, her hands deep in the rich Texas soil. Her body changed in ways that still amazed her every time she caught sight of her reflection or felt the insistent flutter of movement beneath her heart. The pregnancy had announced itself 2 months after that day in the chapel, confirmed by the same doctor who'd once treated her like an unfortunate charity case but now greeted her with respect bordering on deference, and Eleanor had wept when she'd told Cole the news, not from fear but from overwhelming gratitude that their child would be born into love rather than obligation, into a marriage that had transformed from convenience into genuine partnership. The garden had grown beyond anything Eleanor had initially envisioned, expanding from her original plot to encompass nearly an acre of carefully tended beds where vegetables and flowers grew in planned profusion. And it had become something more than just a source of food and beauty. It had become a gathering place, a classroom, a symbol of what plain women could create when given space and resources and encouragement. 3 afternoons a week, Eleanor taught a group of ranch women and townswomen the principles of cultivation and soil management and crop rotation, sharing knowledge she'd accumulated through years of making things grow in difficult conditions, and she watched with satisfaction as her students developed confidence not just in gardening but in themselves, speaking up about their successes, asking questions without apology, claiming space in conversations they'd previously let men dominate. Maria Santos had proven particularly adept, her small plot behind the Santos cottage now producing enough vegetables to sell at market, bringing in income that gave her family breathing room they'd never had, and she'd stood up at the last town meeting to propose that Redemption Creek establish a community garden where women could pool resources and share knowledge, and when the men on the council had initially dismissed the idea, Maria had persisted, had presented a budget and projected returns that made the proposal impossible to ignore, and the council had finally approved it with obvious reluctance but growing respect. Mrs. Patterson had done something even more remarkable, had used skills Eleanor taught her about preserving and pickling to start a small business that's selling specialty goods, her jams and pickles now stocked in stores 3 towns over, and the income had allowed her to hire help at the general store, freeing her time to pursue the business she'd built from her own competence rather than her husband's enterprise. And Eleanor had watched the older woman transform from someone who'd pitied plain Eleanor to someone who thanked Eleanor for showing her that capable hands could build worth independent of male approval or conventional beauty. The sound of boots on the garden path made Eleanor look up, and she felt her heart lift the way it always did when Cole appeared, even after 6 months of genuine partnership, of shared meals and shared bed and shared dreams. The sight of him still stirred something deep in her chest, gratitude and desire and love so tangled together she couldn't separate them. He was carrying a basket, she saw, and when he reached her side he set it down and helped her stand, his hands careful on her arms, his grey eyes scanning her face with the concern that had become habitual since the pregnancy had started showing, checking that she wasn't overdoing it, wasn't exhausting herself, wasn't sacrificing her health for the garden, or the school, or the dozen other projects she'd undertaken. "I'm fine," Eleanor said, anticipating his question. "The baby's fine, we're both healthy and happy and tired of being treated like delicate flowers that might wilt if the wind blows too hard." And Cole's mouth quirked in that small smile she loved, the one that suggested he knew he was being overprotective but couldn't quite help himself. "I brought lunch," he said, holding up the basket. "Thought we could eat here in the garden, since it's too beautiful a day to waste inside. And I wanted to talk to you about something, show you something I found in my mother's journals." They settled on the bench he'd built for her that first month, the wood now weathered and comfortable, fitting into the garden landscape like it had always been there. And Eleanor leaned against Cole's shoulder while he unpacked bread and cheese and fruit and simple food made perfect by being shared in this space they'd created together. The school was going well. Enrollment had grown to 20 children now, their makeshift classroom in the ranch's converted barn bursting with students whose parents had recognized that education was the key to opportunities their generation had lacked. And Eleanor had hired 2 assistants, young women from town who'd graduated from the basic schooling available there and wanted to teach but had no formal training, and she was teaching them pedagogy while they taught the children, creating a system that multiplied knowledge rather than hoarding it. Cole had been skeptical at first about the expense, the drain on ranch resources, but Eleanor had shown him projections, had demonstrated that educated ranch hands were more efficient, made fewer costly mistakes, could read contracts and understand negotiations, and Cole had been convinced not just by the numbers but by watching the children transform, watching them discover that learning was power, that literacy opened worlds, that their futures didn't have to be limited by their parents' circumstances. The profits from Eleanor's innovations, her chicken breeding program and preserved goods and medicinal preparations now funded most of the school's operations, and there was talk in town about establishing a similar school system more broadly, using Hartford Ranch as a model, and Eleanor felt pride in that, felt like perhaps her plainness had become useful in ways she'd never imagined, that her journey from invisible seamstress to respected community leader might inspire others to claim their own worth. Vincent had left Redemption Creek in disgrace the week after the chapel confrontation, his reputation destroyed and his prospects eliminated, and rumour had it he'd gone to California to seek his fortune, though Cole suspected he'd more likely seek poker games and saloons and the kind of dissolute life his mother had hoped marriage might cure. And Eleanor found she didn't hate him anymore, didn't waste energy on resentment, simply felt grateful that his cruelty had forced her and Cole into honesty, had accelerated their transformation from convenient strangers to genuine partners. Beatrice Sutton had married a travelling salesman 3 months after Vincent's defeat, a hasty wedding that suggested either genuine affection or desperate escape from a town that had witnessed her humiliation, and she'd moved to Houston, where presumably her beauty would find better appreciation than it had in Redemption Creek, where people had started valuing different qualities, and Eleanor wished her no particular ill, simply hoped that perhaps marriage to someone who chose her for her appearance might teach Beatrice what it felt like to be valued for the wrong reasons. Cole pulled a leather journal from the basket, one of his mother's volumes that Eleanor recognised, and he opened it to a page he'd marked with a ribbon, his expression suggesting whatever he'd found there mattered to him deeply. "I've been reading these," he said, his voice quiet, "reading them differently now that I understand what my father did to her, seeing things I missed before, and I found this entry from late in their marriage, maybe a year before she died, and I wanted to share it with you because I think she'd want you to read it, want you to know that she understood things I'm only just beginning to grasp." He handed the journal to Eleanor, and she read in Catherine's familiar, elegant handwriting words that made tears prick her eyes. "I caught sight of myself in the mirror today," Catherine had written, "and saw what James has always seen. A plain woman, unremarkable, aging without grace into something even less appealing than I was in youth. And I felt the old shame rise up, the old certainty that I'd failed him by not being beautiful, by not maintaining whatever minimal attractiveness I'd possessed when we married. But then I looked away from the mirror and saw the life I've built, saw the ranch thriving under management that James and I have developed together, saw the garden I've cultivated that feeds our family and our workers, saw the quilt I'm making that will warm our grandchildren someday, saw evidence everywhere of work and care and creation, and I realised something that should have been obvious years ago, that my worth isn't in mirrors, it's in the life I've built, the people I've helped, the beauty I've created through action rather than appearance, and James can see me as plain until the day I die. But I finally see myself as valuable, as worthy, as enough, not because any man says so, but because I know what I've accomplished, and no mirror can take that away from me." Eleanor finished reading with tears streaming down her face, and Cole pulled her close, his own eyes wet, and they sat there in the garden surrounded by beauty Eleanor had created, holding each other, and grieving for Catherine, who'd learned her worth too late, who'd spent most of her life believing the lies about plainness that Eleanor had also internalized. "I don't want our daughter to ever doubt herself the way you did, the way my mother did," Cole said quietly. "Don't want her to look in mirrors searching for flaws or measuring herself against impossible standards. Don't want her to waste years believing she's not good enough. And Eleanor, I've been thinking about how we prevent that, how we raise her to know her value from the beginning rather than having to discover it painfully later." Eleanor had been certain from the moment she'd felt the first flutter of movement that the child she carried was a girl, certain with an instinct that went beyond logic, and she'd started preparing not just physically, but emotionally for the responsibility of raising a daughter who would inevitably face the same pressures Eleanor had faced, the same messages about beauty and worth and where female value resided. "I've been writing too," Eleanor admitted. "Keeping a journal like your mother did, recording things I want our daughter to know, stories about how we met and married and fell in love, about the day in the chapel when you defended me, about what I've learned about real beauty and worth, and I thought when she's old enough I could give her both journals, your mother's and mine. Let her see that women have been fighting these battles for generations, but that each generation can fight a little more successfully, can push the boundaries a little further, can make space for the next generation to grow into their full potential without quite as much damage." Cole kissed her temple, her cheek, her mouth with tender reverence, and Eleanor felt the baby move as if responding to her father's presence, and she took his hand and placed it on her swollen belly so he could feel the flutter of their child. This daughter who would inherit not just Hartford Ranch, but the legacy of two plain people who had refused to accept that plainness meant lesser, who'd built beauty through living fully rather than looking decoratively. The weeks passed and Eleanor's pregnancy advanced, her body growing heavy and uncomfortable but also powerful, creating life through processes that seemed miraculous every time she stopped to consider them, and she continued teaching and managing the household and tending her garden until Cole finally insisted she needed rest, needed to conserve energy for the birth that was rapidly approaching, and Eleanor had reluctantly agreed, though she chafed at inactivity, at being cared for rather than caring for others. The baby arrived on a cold November morning 2 weeks before Eleanor's 27th birthday, after a labour that lasted through the night and into dawn, and when the midwife finally placed the squalling infant in Eleanor's arms, cleaned and wrapped in the blanket Eleanor herself had knitted, she looked into her daughter's face and saw not beauty or plainness but infinite possibility, a life not yet shaped by external judgments, a soul not yet wounded by messages about inadequate appearance. "She's perfect," Cole breathed, his voice thick with emotion, his calloused finger gentle against the baby's tiny hand. "She's absolutely perfect, and Eleanor, she has your hair. Look, that same copper colour. She's going to be beautiful." Our kind of beautiful, Eleanor corrected softly. Strong and capable and kind. Those are the things that matter. Those are the things we'll teach her to value in herself and others. And Cole nodded agreement, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face, already so clearly besotted that Eleanor felt her heart swell with love for both of them. They named her Catherine Eleanor Hartford, honouring both grandmothers, and the baby thrived, growing from tiny helpless infant to alert curious child with the speed that made Eleanor understand why people said time flew, and before she knew it 6 months had passed and that they were preparing for Catherine's baptism, the celebration that would formally welcome her into the Redemption Creek community. The chapel was full again, the same space where Eleanor had declared herself too plain and where Cole had defended her so powerfully, and now it held friends and neighbours gathered to celebrate their daughter. And Eleanor stood at the front with Catherine in her arms and Cole beside her, and felt the fullness of how much had changed in the year since her wedding. Reverend Matthews performed the baptism with gentle efficiency, the holy water touching Catherine's forehead, making her scrunch up her face in adorable displeasure. And afterward, people came forward to offer congratulations and admire the baby. And Eleanor heard the comments she'd expected about how lovely Catherine was, how beautiful, how blessed she was to have such an attractive child. Mrs. Patterson held Catherine with practiced ease, her eyes soft with grandmotherly affection, and said to Eleanor, "She's going to be a beauty, this one. You can see it already in her features. She'll have men lining up when she's grown." Eleanor felt Cole stiffen beside her, felt him preparing to respond, and she squeezed his hand gently, letting him know she had this, that she could handle the well-meaning but misguided compliment. "She'll be Eleanor's daughter," Cole said before Eleanor could speak, his voice carrying that quiet certainty that commanded attention. "So she'll be strong and kind and capable. Those are the two qualities we're going to nurture in her. Those are the things we're going to teach her to value in herself and others. And that's the only beauty that matters, the kind that lasts beyond youth and builds something worth having." Mrs. Patterson looked slightly taken aback but nodded thoughtfully, and Eleanor saw understanding dawn in her eyes, recognition that Cole was offering a different framework for thinking about female worth, and the older woman handed Catherine back with a small smile. "You're right, of course," Mrs. Patterson said. "I spent too many years thinking pretty was the most important thing a woman could be, wasted too much energy worrying about my appearance instead of developing my capabilities, but you two have taught me differently, taught all of us differently, and I hope Karen grows up knowing her value from the beginning, knowing that what she does matters more than how she looks." Eleanor took her daughter back, settling the baby against her shoulder, and felt Cole's arm come around both of them, pulling them close, and she looked around the chapel at the faces of people who'd witnessed her journey, from invisible seamstress to respected community leader, people who'd been changed by that journey almost as much as she had. "And if she ever doubts herself," Eleanor added, meeting Mrs. Patterson's eyes, "if she ever stands in front of a mirror and sees flaws instead of strength, if she ever questions whether she's good enough or pretty enough or worthy enough, we'll tell her the story of how her father made a whole town speechless, how he stood in this very chapel and redefined beauty to include all the things that actually matter, how he chose love over safety and partnership over distance, and how that choice transformed not just our marriage but this entire community." The chapel had gone quiet, people listening, and Eleanor saw several women wiping their eyes, saw men looking thoughtful, saw in their faces the impact of words spoken and lessons learned, saw evidence that change was possible, that communities could evolve, that stories about plainness and beauty and worth could be rewritten if enough people were willing to question old assumptions. Judge Morrison raised his glass of punch, a toast forming, and the whole chapel joined him. To Catherine Hartford, the judge said, "May she grow up knowing that beauty is measured in character, in kindness, in the life you build and the people you help, and the positive change you create in the world, and may she never doubt that she comes from a legacy of extraordinary women who refused to accept that plain meant lesser, and who proved through living fully that real beauty has nothing to do with mirrors, and everything to do with how you treat others and what you build with your capable hands." Everyone drank to that, voices rising in agreement and celebration, and Eleanor felt the weight of collective witness, felt like this moment was sealing something, making permanent the changes that had started with her, wedding and accelerated through the months of her marriage, changes in how Redemption Creek thought about women and worth, and what qualities deserved admiration. Later, after the celebration had wound down and people had departed, and Catherine was sleeping peacefully in the cradle Cole had built with his own hands, Eleanor and Cole rode out to the small cemetery where his parents were buried, where Eleanor had planted flowers months ago and tended them carefully, making sure that Catherine Hartford's grave was marked not just with stone but with living beauty. They stood there in the cooling evening, the Texas sky painted in shades of orange and purple, and Eleanor thought about the woman buried here, the woman whose journals had given her hope, whose story had shown her that marriages could transform, whose hard-won wisdom about worth and beauty had helped Eleanor claim her own value. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered to the grave. "Thank you for writing it all down, for being honest about your struggles, for learning your lessons even when it hurt, for raising a son who could see beyond beauty to value what actually matters. And I promise I'll teach Catherine what you learned. I'll give her the gift of knowing her worth from the beginning instead of having to discover it painfully later. And I'll make sure she knows about you, about the grandmother who fought battles similar to hers and won, even if the victory came late." Cole's arm tightened around her waist, and Eleanor leaned into his strength, into the partnership they'd built from unpromising beginnings, into the love that had grown from practical arrangement into something deep and true and lasting. "We should go home," Cole said softly. "Our daughter will be hungry soon, and Mrs. Chen will be wondering where we've gone. But Eleanor, I want you to know something. Want you to understand what you've given me beyond the obvious gift of Catherine, beyond saving the ranch or improving its profits or any of the practical contributions." Eleanor turned to look at him, seeing in the fading light the face she'd come to love, weathered and serious and dear beyond measure, and she waited for him to continue. "You've given me permission to love without fear," Cole said, his voice rough with emotion. "Taught me that caring about someone's appearance doesn't have to lead to cruelty, that appreciating beauty doesn't mean demanding perfection, that loving you for exactly who and what you are is completely different from what my father did to my mother. And Eleanor, you're beautiful to me, genuinely beautiful, not in spite of your freckles and thin frame and rough hands, but because of them, because they're evidence of the life you've lived and the person you've become, and I'm not afraid anymore that saying so makes me like him, because I finally understand the difference between loving beauty and demanding it, between appreciating what I see and trying to change it." Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, happy tears, this time grateful tears, and she rose on her toes to kiss him, tasting salt and sweetness and the promise of all the years they'd have together, all the challenges they'd face and overcome, all the love they'd share and teach to their daughter. They rode home as the last light faded from the sky, back to Hartford Ranch that had become truly theirs through work and care and stubborn determination to build something lasting, back to the house that Eleanor had transformed from a place of loneliness into a genuine home, back to the daughter who slept peacefully unaware of the legacy she'd inherit, the stories she'd hear, the lessons she'd learn about worth and beauty and what it meant to be a plain woman in a world that valued the wrong things. And as Eleanor settled Catherine to her breast for the late evening feeding, watching her daughter's tiny mouth work with single-minded determination, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from invisible seamstress to rancher's wife to mother to community leader, from someone who believed she was too plain to deserve love to someone who understood that plainness was never the problem, that she'd been measuring herself by standards designed to make her feel inadequate, and that real beauty had nothing to do with whether her features met arbitrary ideals, and everything to do with how she lived, who she helped, what she built with her capable hands and generous heart. She looked up to find Cole watching them, his grey eyes soft with love, and she smiled at him, this man who'd chosen her, who'd defended her, who'd loved her loudly enough that a whole town had to listen, and she felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. Felt like all the pieces of her life had finally aligned into something coherent and meaningful and beautiful in the ways that actually mattered. Tomorrow she would wake and tend her garden and teach her students and manage the household and write in her journal for Catherine to read someday. And she would do it all as Eleanor Hartford. Plain woman, capable woman, beloved woman, beautiful woman, all of those things simultaneously without contradiction. And she would raise her daughter to understand that beauty was a story we told ourselves about worth, and that the best stories, the truest stories, measured value in kindness and strength, and the positive change we created in the world, rather than in mirrors that reflected only surface and revealed nothing of substance. And when Catherine was old enough to understand, Eleanor would tell her the story of how her parents had married as strangers bound by necessity, and transformed through choice and effort into genuine partners. How her father had stood in a chapel and made a whole town speechless by redefining beauty to include all the things that actually mattered. How her mother had gone from being too plain to being everything simply by refusing to accept that plainness meant lesser, and how together they'd built not just a marriage and a family, but a community-wide transformation in how people thought about worth and beauty and what qualities deserved celebration, and perhaps, Eleanor hoped, perhaps that story would be armour against the messages Catherine would inevitably receive about her appearance. Perhaps it would help her understand from the beginning what Eleanor had to learn painfully over years, that she was enough exactly as she was, that her value didn't depend on mirrors or male approval or meeting impossible standards, that real beauty was measured in how you lived and who you helped and what you built with your life, and that plain was just another word for real, for authentic, for worthy of love and respect and celebration, and nothing, absolutely nothing, to be ashamed of or apologise for ever again.